Chapter 11. Brand glanced at Norm on the bench seat beside him as the truck bounced over a big divot in the dirt road. He feathered the gas to make the ride as smooth as possible. Far from wincing, Norm smiled back at Brand and said,
"It's amazing to me just how much you two look alike."
Brand chuckled. This was the same reaction they got from everyone. You do know we're identical twins, right?
Sure, yeah, it's just, I know other twins who have grown away from each other with age, you know. One gets fatter, the other shaves his head, one takes care of his teeth while the other one lets them rot out of his head. That sort of thing.
We're only 22, Norman. Got a ways to go before our teeth rot and we turn fat. Norman laughed with him.
Yeah, that's true. But you two, other than those dark circles under Bronc's eyes from the drinking, you could pass for each other easily.
Yeah, reckon so.
Have you always taken care of him?
Brand gripped the steering wheel harder. How would you know that? Did Dad tell you? Rebecca?
No one has to tell me, son. I got eyes.
Now, what do you see? He shrugged.
Guess it's the way you hover. Watchful. Making sure Bronc don't do himself any harm. Seen it that first day.
Oh, sure, I guess. Yeah, well. Brand slowed to make a right turn onto Lambert Road. I've always taken care of him. It was hard, him being gone for so many months. I worried about him every dang day.
He didn't give you a second thought.
That stung. Brand bit into his lower lip. Yeah, he'd always figured Bronc wouldn't miss him if he weren't around.
Don't mean to upset you, boy. It's just, Bronc is selfish. If he missed you at all, it was for what you could do for him. He's kind of attached to me, though. Not sure why. Maybe it's because I'm trying to teach him about being the man God wants him to be. I'm hoping my words sink in.
Brand gave a non-committal nod. He got that people wanted comfort from something outside of themselves, but it seemed someone with skin on would be a better choice. How you doing after hearing the news today? He could feel Norman's eyes on him, but he didn't look in his direction. Finally, Norman sighed.
It is what it is. God will take me out of this life and into the next when He decides to, not 1 minute before or 1 minute after. God is never early and He's never late, with anything, including the physical death of His children.
Brand's scoff was loud. He didn't intend it to be. Didn't want to be disrespectful to his elders.
Don't believe in God?
Crap. He'd been trying to avoid this conversation. Well, of course I do. He slowed to shimmy over 2 potholes. How'd you and Bronc get so close?
Okay. We won't talk about God. Yet. But we will come back to this.
Norman readjusted himself on the seat.
I could see right off Bronc needed a keeper. It was clear his dad had not succeeded at that job. Probably hadn't been given the opportunity. So I took it upon myself. Didn't give the boy a chance to say no.
Stunned by Norm's audacity, Brand blurted, Maybe we shouldn't give you the chance to say no to chemotherapy. Norman went silent. Brand squirmed inside. He'd overstepped, and there was no taking it back. But maybe Norman was rethinking his decision. He could only hope. So, how would you know about Dad and Bronc? Norman huffed.
Bronc was furious with his dad when they first arrived. Wouldn't even look at Cord for days.
Well, nothing new there. Bronc blames him for lots of things, for never being around, for our mom's death, for forcing him to come to California. Brand realized how that sounded, so he jumped back in. Not because he didn't want to help you understand, but because Dad took him away from Trevor. Brand braked, then veered off onto the dirt and gravel road heading to the entrance to the ranch.
Okay, now, 2 questions and 1 statement. Why does he blame your dad for your mom's death? And why is he mad about Trevor?
Brand hesitated, wondering why he was about to spill his guts. It just felt so effortless. Nothing wrong with your brain, Norman. Okay. First question. Bronc blames Dad because he got Mom pregnant nearly every year of their married life, which was short. And he figures we twins finally killed her, that her body gave out. Hearing his own words out loud brought him up short. How is it he shared that with a perfect stranger? No wonder Bronc had grown so close to Norman. He had a way of coaxing the truth out of you.
Whoa, stop right there. The other question in a minute. Since I've known your dad, I cannot believe he'd make a purposeful decision that would hurt your mom. He's always been loyal, caring, and hard-working, and you can be sure I've been noticing since he's married to my daughter. So, why would Bronc blame your dad for your mom's death?
He figured Dad wouldn't leave her alone.
Like, not lay with her?
Yes.
Bronc does know that's part of marriage, don't he?
Well, of course. Just thought he should give her more time between.
Ah, I see. Understandable. Yet it seems that would be a decision they would make as a couple. But, okay. Why aren't you angry with your dad about that?
He hadn't thought he was angry, but maybe he was. Had he just suppressed that anger since Bronc was angry enough for them both?
Your silence says it all, my dear boy. You are angry with him.
But I shouldn't be.
In my estimation, no. You neither one should be.
Now real resentment flared to life inside Brand, toward his dad and toward Norman for not understanding. Why not?
God can help you with unforgiveness, son. Even though I don't think there is anything to forgive. Maybe your dad and Mom made a bad judgment call, but that's not a sin. And it wasn't your fault either. It's just life. It happens. God is in charge of life and death, not you.
Brand stared at the gravel road ahead. If God didn't blame their dad, why did they? The thought wrapped around him like a wet shirt, sticky and cloying. He made the turn into the ranch and nosed them down the levee to the gate. Norman opened his mouth to speak. Hold that thought, Brand said. Gotta get the gate. As Brand tromped forward to unlatch the gate, the Delta breeze played with the tail of his flannel shirt. He breathed deeply. The gate swung out of his grip in a smooth, silent arc. He wanted to be free like that, not all bound up in knots inside. The breeze ruffled his shirt again. Brand turned to see Norman studying him through the windshield, a kind smile on his wizened face. This was a start. Somehow, Brand knew Norman could show him the way. Brand hopped back into the truck and nodded toward Norm with fresh eyes. Go on. He drove through, leaving the gate open for Bronc. The old man pressed his lips together.
Now, why didn't Bronc want to leave Trevor?
Brand made the wide left turn to head toward the center camp. Okay, well, you know Trev is the oldest brother. He runs the Bar 6 for years now, and he's worn out. Usually works 16-hour days or more. Doesn't date, doesn't make time for fun.
He's ugly, huh?
Brand barked a laugh. Oh, Trevor ugly? That's blasphemous.
Well, I'd save that word for accounts against God, but okay. I'll bite. Why?
Brand was increasingly impressed with Norman and how sharp he was. If you saw him, you'd get it. Rugged and handsome, has the best smile of us all. A lady killer. He just doesn't make time for the ladies. Ever. Norm started laughing. What's so funny?
Have you looked at yourself in the mirror lately? You're no slouch.
Brand grinned. Why, thank you, Norman. But Trevor is Cooper times 10.
Wow. He knows you feel that way?
Brand pulled the truck into the makeshift parking space next to the house, close enough to get Norman in there easily. Turned off the engine. He's afraid a woman will distract him from what's important.
The ranch.
Norman frowned, and Brand saw years of blood, sweat, and worry baked into the man's own crow's feet. If anyone would understand, it was Norman. The Bar 6 is going under, Norman. We've had a lot of sabotage in the last few years. Someone is out to destroy the Coopers. Norman sat up straighter and stared into Brand's eyes.
Why hasn't anyone mentioned this to me?
Ah, shoot. He shouldn't have said it. Norm was just too easy to talk to. I'm sure they didn't want to worry you. Now I've gone and done it anyway. Forget I told you.
Not too late now, son. Before my accident, I do remember Rebecca mentioning a few incidents on the Cooper Ranch, but I thought it was just vandals. Happens everywhere.
In for a penny, in for a pound. He'd already said too much. May as well finish. It's more than that.
More?
It isn't just the sabotage that has come down heavy on Trev. If you think Bronc has a problem with Dad, you should see how Trevor acts around him. He obeys him, sure, but only so he won't have to have a conversation with him. He calls him Coop instead of any father title.
Because?
Well, listen, Norman. I'll tell you about my brothers if you promise to tell me about your take on Bronc's problem. Deal?
Deal.
Well, that was easy enough. The truck pinged and creaked as it cooled. Okay. All my brothers resent Dad for not being there for us growing up. Whenever we had a game or spelling bee or ward, you name it, Dad never showed up. Maria would come.
Maria was your housekeeper for years, right?
Yeah, and our only mother figure. She handled all stuff Cooper's son. Dad handled the ranch until we were grown. Then he took off to help the neighboring widow with her ranch, which put the last nail in his coffin with his sons. Except for me.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Hold on. Why did he work for the widow neighbor?
For pay, to help the ranch financially, and to get a herd of breeding stock yearlings from her in exchange for work, to keep our 6 from going under.
Phew. Hard to keep up. So, your dad was working his tail off to support you kids and keep the ranch running however he knew how.
Exactly. But my brothers don't see it that way. They all felt neglected and therefore believed Dad failed us as a father. Well, at least they did. Since Colt Clay and Hunter found love, he refused to say God. They have forgiven Dad his faults.
Which leaves you and Trevor and Bronc. But you're saying you're personally okay.
It wasn't a statement, more of a recap. Brand noted Norman looked skeptical. What was Norman seeing? Brand had been telling himself he was okay for so long. Was it possible it might not be true? That's right.
Okay. More about that later.
Brand scowled. He didn't need anyone analyzing him. He was just fine, and if he wasn't, it was nobody's business.
This helps me understand your twin a bit better and why he feels the way he does about your dad. But the drinking has me concerned. I bet it wasn't his relationship with his dad that got him drinking more lately. Something got his dander up. Anything you know about?
No, that's why I'm here, and why I wanted to talk to you about him. How long has he been this far gone?
Few weeks.
Well, maybe we should talk to him together. Shelley could help, too. It's obvious she really cares about him. Brand stopped, dropped his head. Oh, no.
What?
They should be here by now. What do you want to bet Bronc talked Shelley into taking him drinking? Norman groaned but nodded his agreement. By the way, what is the statement? Brand asked. Norman's brows knit together in confusion. You said 2 questions and 1 statement. We handled the question. What's the statement? Norman arched his eyebrows, looked impressed.
Okay. I'll give it to you straight. I want to lead by example, and stubbornness or fear are not examples I want to pass on. You made me stop to think with your statement. Maybe we shouldn't give you the chance to say no to chemotherapy.
Brand's heart lifted. And?
I'll get in touch with the doctor and begin right away.
Where are we going? That was the turnoff for the ranch. Shelley twisted her head back toward the road they just passed. Need a drink. Her stomach plummeted. She glanced at her watch. It was only 2 p.m. He was doing this now? But of course he was. Don't you want to make sure Norm is settled in? Bronc looked briefly stricken, then gripped the steering wheel harder and floored the gas pedal. Brand's got him. He'll be fine. Shelley sagged back into the seat. Bronc was so much worse lately. With every drink, he was becoming more mouthy, more belligerent, and even more handsy. But this, right now, this race to the bar was outright denial. She cared deeply about the guy, but didn't know how to help him. She'd heard a local church had started a recovery program for alcoholics. Maybe she should look into it. Feeling sick to her stomach, she asked, "Why do you need a drink?" He threw her a hostile look. "Watch the road," Shelley said. Bronc had already faced forward again. "Let me drive." "Why do you think I need a drink?" Twisting her hands in her lap, she debated how much she should say. She rarely corrected him on anything. The last thing she wanted to do was push him away. What good could she do him then? "I get you're worried about Norman. I am too. But numbing the pain isn't the way to go, Bronc." "I should drop you off first." Well, shoot. She should have taken her own advice and shut the heck up. "No, I'm fine. Find a bar. I'll go with you." Someone would have to drive him home. Maybe with Norm's news so fresh, Bronc would open up about what was driving his escalation over the last several weeks. Something had to have caused it. "Fine. We'll go home by way of Wimpy's." Good. She had an ally in Tony. Maybe between the 2 of them, they'd work the answers out of Bronc. Bronc hung a right just before the bridge and parked in the dirt parking lot. The gentleman that he was, he strode around the front bumper to her side of the truck and opened her door. She knew he liked to do this, even though she was fully capable of opening her own door. So she took his proffered hand and hopped out with deep appreciation for the man he was when sober. But that man was fast slipping away. His hand slid out of hers. He headed for the restaurant door, 3 strides ahead of her already. She pressed her tingling palm against her jeans and followed in silence. He was headed down a dark path, and she had no control over any of it. Maybe she should spend some time on her knees, talk to God about him. She sure hadn't done enough of that in her adult years. He opened the door to Wimpy's and waited for her. "Hungry?" he asked. "We could go in the cafe first if you want." Yes, that was a good idea. Put some food in his stomach before he loaded up with whiskey. "I'm famished." He gave her a lopsided grin that set off flutters in her belly. He was such an attractive man. Add that to the heart of gold he'd tried to hide, and he'd owned her heart before their first 2 weeks had even passed. That was 10 months ago, and she had nothing to show for it. He'd smoothly slipped her right into the friend category, and she'd been there ever since. After 2 hours, a hamburger and a half a dozen shots of whiskey later, Bronc had become the charmer he assumed everyone enjoyed, and none of them did. She nudged him in the shoulder from her neighboring bar stool. "Why do you do it, Bronc Buster? Why do you drink so much?" He turned to her and slid a hand around the nape of her neck, bringing her in close. "How about a kiss?" He leaned in closer. The smell of whiskey radiated from his breath, but that didn't dissuade her desire to kiss him. She wanted to, more than she wanted air, but he would never remember this tomorrow, and she deserved better. She started to pull away, but his gaze snared her. He seemed to be studying her eyes, as if he'd need to describe them to someone later. His confidence took her breath away. She stared back, noting each swirl of autumn color in his irises. But his pupils were dilated from alcohol, and she felt herself deflating. His affection was a lie, and it would shatter her if she let him in too close. She looked away. "Come on, don't be a rebel. Give old Bronc Buster here a kiss." Bronc's voice was low and lusty and so appealing. It was all she could do not to succumb. But she knew better. This was not him. It was the alcohol talking. She put a hand to his chest, pushing him back subtly, ripping her heart a tad in the process. "Hold that thought. I need to talk to Tony for a few minutes. Will you wait for me?" He grinned that powerful grin of his, the one that knocked her socks off. He didn't even know the kind of power he had over her when he did that. Scooting backward off the bar stool, Shelley grinned back at him and then gave him a pat on the cheek. Then she turned and skedaddled toward the kitchen. "Tony, you back here?" "Right here." His voice came from behind the swinging doors. A few seconds later, he walked through them, wiping his hands with a towel, a white apron wrapped double and tied around his belly. "Hey there, Shelley. Did you and Bronc need more food?" "No. Tony." She heaved a sigh, not even knowing what to ask him. Tony's smile faded. "He drunk already?" She grimaced, then rubbed a hand down her throat, squeezing a bit, trying her best to hold back tears. She wasn't a crier by nature, but her emotions were all over the place when it came to Bronc. "He's on his 6th whiskey. He's going to kill himself with that alcohol. I don't know what to do." Tony slapped the towel onto the stainless steel counter and stuffed his fists on his hips. "He's on quite a tear. This makes what, 3 weeks straight?" Shelley nodded miserably. "His brother asked me last night what was going on with him." Tony tipped his chin toward her. "You got any idea?" She slumped. "I was hoping you did." "You got to dig around in his head and find out why he's taken such a nosedive." Shelley wilted inside. "I don't want to make him mad and push me away. Then what good am I to him?" "He's not going to remember tomorrow. You can dig. If he acts like he remembers, he's fooling you. You may as well do this. You already take care of him." She snapped her head up, searching his eyes. "What do you mean?" Could Tony possibly know her feelings for Bronc? Couldn't be. She'd been so careful. He shrugged. Seen with him, is all. She felt the heat of a blush in her cheeks, looked down at her feet. I'm not his girl, Tony. Could have fooled me. He chuckled, then sobered. What you do for Bronc is unique. That kind of loyalty comes from a good heart. Well, thank you for saying that. But tell me, what can this good heart do for our broken man? Dig for answers, Shell. Dig and find the pain. Chapter 12. After an hour of Tony plying Bronc with coffee and water, they got a partially sobered Bronc into the truck for her to drive home. The silence in the vehicle was stifling, right along with the air. It wasn't from a warm evening. It was, in fact, chilly with the smell of rain in the air. She tried to focus her thoughts on how to dig and find the pain, but she was having a miserable time of it. Desperate, she shot up a prayer. But being rusty, she didn't want to presume too much. Lord, please let the harvest come in before the rain hits, or Norman will have another bad year, one he could scarcely afford. That was a good prayer, right? Not selfish, but also not quite on target for what she needed right this moment. She glanced at Bronc. Lord, a little help? If God was God, he'd know what she meant. Bronc sat stiff-backed and focused straight forward. She wondered what he was thinking, or if his mind was in gear at all. You okay over there? It was time to dig. No answer. Bronc? He grunted his answer, but didn't turn her way. What are you thinking? About what? She sighed. Exactly. Nothing. It was now or never. She had to hit it head on. Like each time she stood in front of Tank and reached out to lead the huge bull by the ear. What has you drinking so much, Bronc Buster? What? That seemed to wake him up. He turned his head toward her. She could feel his stare. You're drinking more these days. Why? I don't know what you mean. The slurred words didn't fool her. He often faked drunk confusion when he didn't want to be held accountable for anything, or didn't want to answer a question. He'd done it at the bar, and he was doing it again. Not believing it, big guy. You do know what I mean. You drink, sure, but never like this. She turned onto the side road that led to the ranch and stopped the truck, then pushed the gear shift into neutral and shifted in her seat so she could see him better. He was fidgety, another sure sign he was pulling her leg. Why are we stopping? That sentence was clear enough. By his widened eyes, he knew he was caught. Ah, rebel. Come over here and get us a kiss. Typical, but she'd gotten smarter through the months. What would he do if she called his bluff? Tilting her head, she scrutinized him. It was her turn to shock him. She scooted so fast across the seat that she rammed her left knee into the shifter on the way. Grimaced, but ignored the pain. Her arms went around his neck as he dug in his heels and shoved himself backward into the door. Oh, don't want a kiss then, she smirked, knowing she had him. What? Well, yeah, of course I want a kiss. He visibly relaxed the tension in his limbs then and pulled her across his lap. She squeaked, but held her tongue. Another ruse. She was pretty sure he would not play this out to the end. She smiled and leaned in, giving him a kiss on the cheek. His skin was warm and inviting. He smelled of soap and whiskey and Bronc. which was fresh air, hay, and heaven. His unshaven face scraped against her tender skin. She lingered longer than she should have until she felt him stiffen. Moving forward with her plan, thinking he was still too drunk to mentally keep up, she said, "Well, big guy, let's have that kiss." She licked her lips, and unexpectedly the mood shifted. Bronc's eyes dropped to her mouth, and his nostrils flared. She parted her lips to get enough air. The game had ended, and something momentous had taken its place. His hand pressed into her upper back as he reached up with the other to remove his hat. Having run out of air, she sucked in a quick breath, then held it. What was he up to? Would he truly kiss her? Because he wanted to? Or to distract her? Tony's voice busted through her addled thoughts. Dig for an answer, Shell. Dig and find the pain. With great regret, she slipped her arms from around his neck. Chilly air pushed between them, cooling her ardor and saddening her heart. She raised her eyes to his and was surprised to see desire there. Was that real? It didn't matter. She had a job to do. Bronc, answer the question. And knowing that he was going to play dumb, she repeated it. What has you drinking more lately? His eyes shifted from one of her eyes to the other and back again, a look of surrender finally filling his expression. Rebel, we don't need to talk about this. I'm fine, really. You're clearly not fine, Buster. What's wrong? Of all people, you can tell me. Please, Bronc, tell me. She drew closer, peering more directly into his eyes. He dropped his gaze to her lap. A faraway expression came over him just before he reached up and ran a hand through his hair, making it even more disheveled. You don't want to know. Look at me. He obeyed immediately. She had that effect on him when he was drunk, rarely when he wasn't. Today, she'd take advantage of the lingering effects of the alcohol. I want to know. Tell me. Right now. He shifted his weight to try to deposit her off his lap, but she stayed planted and waited. Finally, he pulled in a deep breath, and being this close, she could feel the weight of the world heavy on him. He dropped his gaze to her lap again. It's Norman. I'm worried about him. She shook her head. She knew that wasn't it, but if he was sober enough to deflect, she was losing the battle. That's what you're going with? It's what's wrong. I'm drinking too much, I know. But it's because I don't know how to help Norman. And now he's refusing chemo. His eyes implored her. You gotta understand. I'm the wild one, the irresponsible one. No one expects me to care. It makes it hard for me to help without everyone assuming I have an ulterior motive. He looked so dejected. She wondered if this was in fact what he'd been so distraught about. She teetered on the point of a needle inside, but that didn't explain his escalation 3 weeks ago. Still, Norm's plight might be part of the bigger issue. Why don't you ask Norm what else you can do to help? Bronc's gaze snapped back to hers. She couldn't see the browns and golds in his irises, but the swirls of green caught the moonlight and sparkled, now that his pupils had gone back to normal. Beautiful eyes she saw in her dreams. Just that simple? Yes. You always have been direct. He smiled. She smiled back, then felt her grin fade. Not about everything. She scooted out of his lap and back toward the steering wheel, her back tingling where his hand had been, where she wished with all her heart his hand could still be. Okay. He reached for his hat. Once it was back in place, an idea seemed to be two. I'll talk to him tomorrow. About his chemo. And about maybe handling the books. You do bookkeeping? Well, I never have, but he can teach me. His grin warmed her. He seemed to be feeling better. You seem a little more sober now. His eyes glanced around as if he were contemplating that thought. Yeah, I think I am. Best be getting back. Big day tomorrow, and I want a clear head to talk with Norman. Shelley's heart swelled with pride in him. She dared to dream that she could build a life with Bronc, sober and whole, and forever have a ringside seat to his big heart. If he stopped drinking, maybe the two of them had a chance. Bronc took her hand gently. His hand was large and warm, engulfing hers deep in his palm. Shell? Yes. The word barely came out on a gush of breath. Hope soared. He rocked back a hair. I'm sorry for baiting you to kiss me. I didn't mean it. You don't deserve my teasing. Thank you for being such a good friend. Stunned that he'd clearly placed her back into the friend zone, her mouth dropped open. You're always there for me, he continued. Always a helper and savior, taking care of me when I'm drunk. You're the best. He rubbed his thumb over her skin, which had gone cold. She wondered if he'd noticed. Her words log-jammed in her throat, stifled by a lump, so she only nodded. Let's go home. He let go and set his sights on the road ahead. That was her signal to swivel back into position and put them in gear. She released the clutch with a bump and a hiccup and jerk until she forced her brain to work and gave it some gas. Maybe it was time she let loose of her hope for a true relationship with Bronc. Like helium-filled balloons, she should release that hope to the heavens and set her sights on someone who could give her more. Just the thought alone shattered her worn-out heart, but it was time. If it wasn't for the fact Norman really needed her help on this ranch, she would tuck tail and run back to the safety of her home. Chapter 13. Bronc slipped into the back door of the kitchen, not wanting to disturb the mood after Norman's diagnosis. Brand stood back while Bronc took a few steps in to sidle up behind Marie at the stove. Morning, Marie, he said to the top of her head. Morning, she said flatly, while flipping bacon like it would burn if left for even 3 seconds. Her movements stiff and choppy. He glanced over to the dining table. Looked like Norman's favorite breakfast treat of biscuits and gravy was laid out there waiting for Marie to finish the rest of the meal. Frying pans of bacon, fried potatoes, and eggs sizzled as they took up space on the stovetop. Rebecca kept glancing into Marie's face, making sure she was okay before taking another platter of food from her. Bronc twisted around Marie and bent to look into her eyes, seeing red rims and sadness. You okay there, Marie? Sure. Just gotta get this all on the table. Can you take this in? She shoved a platter of scrambled eggs in his hands. He handed it off to Brand, then took her by the shoulders to turn her toward him. He's going to be all right, Marie. He has to be. Her next breath was more of a whimper. She squeezed her eyes shut, took a deep breath, and nodded. He started to pull her in for a hug, but she was too quick. Here, take this, will you? She pushed the platter of bacon into his stomach. Go see Norm. He took the plate. She swung back to the stove. He could see she needed a minute. Rebecca came back then to grab the bowl of potatoes. Looked and smelled scrumptious. Bronc wondered if the knot in his stomach would let him enjoy it. Everyone filled in and quietly took a seat around the table. Norman began the process of serving himself from the head of the table, then passed each platter to the right. Once everyone got their food, he offered grace, then looked each in the eye as they began to eat. This is not the best subject for the breakfast table,
But since I have you all together, I have something to say. I know you've all heard by now that I've got leukemia. I wasn't going to do chemotherapy because of all the side effects, but after sleeping on it, I've decided to do it. Rebecca and Marie both sucked in relieved breaths at the news, but remained silent. Everyone around the table, Cord, Brand, Bronc, Alfred, Gilbert, and Herman, all stared in Norman's direction, waiting patiently for more. After a few silent moments, Cord jumped in. "Why'd you change your mind?" Norm looked at Brand and smiled. "When I know the right thing to do for a person, I don't give the other guy a chance to say no. Brand reminded me yesterday that that blade cuts both ways, and none of you want to give me the chance to say no either." Cord rubbed a finger across his brow. "Well, that's right. We just didn't know how to force a yes out of you. We're all relieved you decided to give it a try." The crew around the table all nodded and gave verbal amens. Then they all dropped their heads to their plates and silently savored their meal. When the group finished and dispersed for their workday, Bronc wiped his mouth with his napkin and put a hand on Norman's forearm, stopping him from rising. "Hold on a minute, Norm. I've been thinking." "Did it hurt?" Norm returned. Bronc blinked, then chuckled, amazed that Norman hadn't lost his sense of humor. "Yeah, most of the time." Grinning, he started again, hoping Norman would be receptive. "Listen, with the chemo, you're going to need a little more help around here. Maybe someone can take over the bookkeeping." Norman tilted his head to one side. Interesting. Marie and I would surely appreciate the break, given the charity auction she organizes this time of year. There's always something in the community or our church she's neck deep in. Got anybody in mind?" "Ha ha." Norman studied him then. Bronc could see the wheels turning. He wondered if this was about his drinking, again. No one realized he could actually think better when he drank. It was everyone else who thought his drinking was a problem. "I'm serious, son. You got someone in mind?" Bronc scowled, jumped to his feet, and stuffed his hands in his pockets. "Don't you think I'm smart enough?" "Course I do, when you decide sober is smart enough." Bronc took a step closer, loomed over Norman. The man didn't even wince. "Drinking doesn't do anything to me, except make me more confident. Besides, I'm sober right now. Always am during the day." Norman looked him over. Bronc averted his too dry and too red eyes toward the small window in the back of the dining room, avoiding the scrutiny. "That's debatable. You have all the symptoms of a hangover, and that's just as bad as being drunk as a skunk, as far as your brain is concerned. Also means you got booze in your system still. As often as you drink, it never really has time to leave you, does it?" Bronc planted his legs wide. "Doesn't matter. I can still help with the dang books." "Does matter. Listen, son. I appreciate you more than you know. You cart me around. I always make sure I'm informed about what your dad is doing overseeing the ranch. Help me organize the laborers." Bronc raised his brows. "Exactly." "Don't think I don't notice all the extras you do for me. But when it comes to the books, it will take a keen mind, one that is not riddled with alcohol. It dulls the senses and scrambles comprehension. You have to give it up if you want to help me with that task. Can you do that?" Norman didn't have a clue, and who was he to judge? Besides, Bronc never hurt anyone else, only himself. It was nobody's business. "I don't know why you're fighting me on this. It's for you I want to do this. Don't you get it?" "Don't you get that your spiritual and physical well-being are more important to me?" The fight went out of Bronc a little.
He loved that Norman felt that way about him. But why was he so worried about whether he was spiritual or not? Told you before, don't need God. Never have. The dogs began barking outside, and by the sound of them, it was a stranger or a critter they were yapping over. Bronc started toward the front door, but thrust a pointed finger at Norman. This discussion is not over. About the books, I mean. Bronc was out of the door before Norman could reply. He strode around the house to view the road in time to see Shell jam the parking brake down and scoot out of the doorless work truck, while a young man clambered out of the passenger side, straightened his cowboy hat, and wiped dust off his sleeve. The flirty smile on Shell's face set Bronc's teeth on edge. Then she giggled, and Bronc could only stare. The tinkling sound caught him right in the gut. It was feminine and rousing and reached right into his being, touching something that had never been touched before. He ran his gaze down from her smiling face to her booted toes. She was dressed the same as usual. Jeans, a flannel shirt and red and white plaid tucked in under a belt at her tiny waist. Same boots, same shiny ponytail swishing around her shoulders as she animatedly responded to things the man was saying. Her cheeks were flushed pink, and her eyes sparkled in a way they had for him more than once. Bronc's heart picked up its pace, and everything inside him started to churn with emotion. Where were these feelings coming from? He sloughed it off, refusing to look too closely. Even if he did have a bone-deep need to sock the new guy right in his smirking mouth. Getting his feet moving again, Bronc hustled to intercept them at the walkway and stood, legs spread, hands on his hips. What's up? Shell's head twisted in his direction, giggles ceasing. When her smile fell off completely, it felt like the sun had gone behind a cloud. Bronc almost shivered in the sudden cold and glanced at the new guy again, who was still smiling at Shell. Bronc's rage ramped back up. Shell blinked up at him. Bronc, this is Stephen Anderson. He's a real estate developer from the Bay Area. He wants to speak with Norman. The man was several inches shorter than Bronc, dressed impeccably with a look of wealthy rancher rather than a paper pusher. That made Bronc even madder. A land-grabbing tycoon, eh? Bronc said, none too nicely. Bronc! Shell grasped his hand and squeezed. It was meant to be a reprimand, but turned into anything but. Tingle shot up his arm and into his head, making him a little fuzzy. Giving his head a shake, he met her challenging glare. Stephen Anderson chuckled. It's okay. I'm used to it. They ignored the man, their eyes still locked. Shell's had widened. Had she felt those tingles too? She cleared her throat. Is Norman inside? I'll go see if he's up to company. You stay out here. Ripping his gaze from hers, Bronc thrust a finger at the round table that sat on the lawn. Still agitated by the flirting he'd witnessed, and furious at himself for noticing. As he strode back to the house, all he could think about was getting away from these people. A whiskey or two at L's or Wimpy's would fix him right up. He slammed through the door, startling Norman, then feeling bad about it. Sorry, Norm. Didn't mean to be so loud. Seems to me you did, he grunted. What's going on out there? Norm pointed his chin at the front window. There's a property tycoon here wanting to talk to you. Don't let him talk you into selling, Norm. Relax, son. I'll talk to him. Send him in. Bronc gave Norm a good once-over. The old man looked composed enough. He wished Bronc were here instead of in the cornfield. His brother had a gift for deciphering what people were thinking, but since Dad was teaching him how to use the big combine harvester, they likely wouldn't be back until supper. How about I bring you out to the garden table? I'll get Marie or Rebecca to offer him refreshments. That way you can leave the conversation when you want to, and I won't have to hoist him up and out of the house by his collar." Norm laughed.
"You think he's going to force me into something?"
"Not on my watch."
"Fine, if it makes you feel better."
Kicking the mogul off the ranch right now would make him feel better, but he wouldn't deprive Norman of the chance to talk about God with a stranger. He squirmed a little inside, remembering the first conversation he'd ever had with Norman, the clear-as-day conversation he had with the sleeping man in the hospital. It haunted him still. Was he being the man God wanted him to be? Bronc winced. "Here, put your coat on. Not exactly warm out there. I smell rain in the air. Let's go. I'll carry you."
No, not a good visual for you to carry me. Send in Marie, then get my cane."
Bronc found Marie upstairs changing the sheets on the beds, then snatched Norman's cane from where it leaned in the corner and brought it to him.
"Thanks, son."
"Hi, sweetheart. Are you all right?" Marie said, walking into the living room. She leaned down to kiss Norman on the top of the head.
"Fine, hun. Another developer has come to talk us out of our land. Can you bring us out some refreshments?"
She harumphed, landing her aging hands on her generous hips. "Again? You gonna kick him off?"
"What do you think?"
Marie gave him a side look that told Bronc she knew that wasn't his plan, but didn't like it one bit. "Why do you put up with these men? You don't plan to ever sell our kids' and grandkids' legacy, so why act like you might?"
"You know why."
Her sweet face looked to the ceiling as she drew in a breath and sighed. "Yes, I know. You want to talk to him about God." Norman didn't say another word, just grinned.
"Come here, sweet wife, and give me a real kiss."
She tittered, but leaned down to give him a quick peck on his lips. "There's no changing you." Norman's mouth flew open, and his eyebrows rose.
"And you want to?"
She rubbed him on his balding head, then smoothed his wispy hair back into place. "Never. I'll bring out their treats. You've had enough to eat. Just don't string the poor man along too long." Bronc eased Norman up to his feet and headed for the front door to help the old man don his coat. With one hand on the doorknob, Bronc made to go out with him, but Norman stopped him.
"I can make it alone. You help Marie with the man's refreshments."
Bronc hesitated, then nodded, staying put long enough to watch Norman totter from the sidewalk to the lawn. When Bronc turned back to the kitchen and retrieved the coffee pot from the counter, cups and pot in hand, he followed Marie and her plate full of cookies to the outdoor table. This Stephen person already had Shell and Norman wrapped around his finger, deep in conversation. Both had leaned in, their elbows on the table, their faces solemn, eyes wide. Bronc itched even more to throw the man off the property, but for Norman's sake, he kept his trap shut. "Hello, Shelley. Here you go, everyone," Marie said, the good hostess as always. "Coffee and shortbread cookies." Shell smiled up at her. "Hi, Marie." "This looks great. You must be Norman's daughter," Stephen said with a sly grin. Bronc felt a growl come up his throat. All three set of eyes stared back at him. Was Norman going to be pulled in this time by the big business con man? "That compliment is as old as the hills, tycoon." Marie bopped Bronc on the arm. "Mind your manners." Stephen laughed. "It's no problem. I'm used to this. You must understand, he's worried I might take something from you that you don't want to give. Don't need you to take my side. I can handle myself." Bronc was getting dangerously close to ripping the man's smile off his face, especially when the man winked at Shell. She was too darn naive to realize what a creep this guy was. Wait a minute. Why was Shell even invited to this conversation? Suddenly, Bronc understood. He'd watched Brand's smooth charm in action often enough to know what Sleaze Anderson was up to. This tycoon was interested in much more than just flirting. Bronc backed a couple of feet and gripped his hands together behind his back. He wouldn't interject anymore, but he wouldn't leave Shell or Norman's side either.
"Sorry, Marie," Norman started. "Should have introduced you. This is Stephen Anderson, real estate developer from Delta Land Company. They're interested in buying our land to build a marina along the slough."
"You don't say. You interested?" Marie subtly winked at Norman and then smiled at Mr. Anderson.
"Might be. Been talking about where he attends church."
Norman winked back at Marie. "Well, isn't that nice?" She smiled at the man. "So nice to meet you, Mr. Anderson. I'll just take this in." She gestured toward the empty tray. "And leave you to it." She turned and walked off. They continued their conversation, Norman asking questions about the man's church and his relationship with Jesus, the man eyeing Shell with intermittent smiles. When the man asked Shell if she came with the property, Bronc stopped grinding his molars and stepped forward. "Shell, I think it's time you get back to work. I'll drive Mr. Anderson back to his vehicle when Norman's done." Sleaze Anderson stopped her with a hand to her forearm. Bronc saw red. "No need to bother you," the man said. "I'm ready to go. Shelley can drive me back. I'll set up another time with Mr. Harper." Bronc pulled Sleaze's hand off her arm. "Shell needs to go back to work. The cattle need feeding." Bronc nodded his head toward the truck, and Shell's smile disappeared. Bronc's gut flipped, but he continued on the path he'd chosen. He softened his words. "I can see to Mr. Anderson, Shell. You go on ahead." One of the tycoon's eyebrows lifted. "You feed the cattle?" She smiled, though this time it was dim and forced. "Sure I do. Whatever needs to be done." She shot a glance at Bronc. It was none too sweet. Bronc let go of Sleaze's arm. Every one of her glances added a little more emotion and a lot more tension to his discomfort. He couldn't remember a time when he'd paid so much attention to Shell. But then again, he couldn't remember a time when another man showed interest in her either. Was it a territorial thing with him, or something else? Befuddled, Bronc touched her arm and gave it a little lift. Not enough to force her up, just enough to offer help. She relented and followed his lead. "I'll just get Shell here to the truck and give her some instructions. You keep talking." The tycoon opened his mouth to speak, but Norman jumped in to continue his talk about church and God. Bronc grinned to himself. Norman always seemed to know how to help. Bronc kept his hand wrapped around Shell's elbow. Surprised, his fingers overlapped her small bones and guided her over the uneven lawn to the truck. She hopped in and faced him. "What are you doing?" "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb with me, Bronc Cooper. I've never seen you act this way before." He had no answer for her, so he ignored the question. "You'll need to start the second row of hay bales in the barn. Cleaned out the rest of that first row yesterday. Check Tank's gait. Make sure he's not limping from that mishap of his." "Excuse me, boss," she interrupted. "You didn't answer my question." "You've already wasted part of your morning. Time to work." Bronc backed up and would have slammed her door if she'd had one. Shell narrowed her eyes, looking part suspicious, part agitated. He couldn't blame her. He was being an idiot, but he didn't care as long as he got her the heck out of here. The last thing she needed was to try to navigate a man like Sleaze Anderson. He'd watched Trevor deal with powerful and ruthless men like him before. Saboteurs and tycoons could never resist jumping on fresh meat. That thought brought a slice of pain and a reminder. It had been Bronc who had put the latest nail in the coffin of the Bar 6, and he'd best never forget that. Chapter 14. The day had been hard, and Bronc was beat. He had his sights set on one thing and one thing only: whiskey. Striding toward his truck, he shot a glance over his shoulder to make sure no one was following him, and was momentarily struck by the magnificent colors of the sunset resting on the west side's levee. Coming to a standstill, he turned toward it. Norman reminded him often who was in charge of sunsets, along with every other piece of creation on this earth: Jesus Christ, Messiah, Son of the living God. Bronc had always argued that point or ignored it, thinking how far-fetched it seemed. Somehow, this time, it felt right. He studied the western sky, began to see why Norman felt the way he did. Today, the clouds were set afire with brilliant reds and oranges, muted pinks and yellows, all with blue sky peeking through. White streaks, as if giant fingertips had run through it, spread over the entire expanse above. Though sunsets gave him temporary solace, he never changed the churning of regret in his gut. Each day was worse. He had so much to answer for. There was no way a perfect God, the creator of all the heavens and earth, would want anything to do with this messed-up human being. The Almighty had so many good people to choose from. Like Shelley, for instance. Why had she come to mind? Oh, he knew why. That tycoon may have tied up Norman's time all afternoon, but at least Shell wasn't there to toss her head and smile prettily at him. Bronc realized his hands were clamped into fists. Shelley's interactions had never bothered him before. So why now? I've never seen her flirt before. Well, that was true. Had she never flirted, or had he never looked that close? He shook the thought away and jumped into the pickup. The combine was still crawling through the cornfield to the south. He could sneak off the ranch with Brand and his dad, none the wiser. He wanted a night on the town with no one to whine in his ear about drinking too much. Why should they care? He wasn't hurting anyone. He arrived at Al the Wop's only to find no parking spaces. He groaned, drove on around the circle, then came back to the front door to wait for someone to leave. He didn't want to have to walk half a mile to the darned bar. As he idled, the door opened and a flurry of color caught in the breeze. The flowery dress of oranges, reds, and yellows reminded him of the sunset. He glanced at the woman's face, all feminine grace and beauty, and recognition dawned. Julia. Her head was down, watching where she was going or avoiding the breeze in her face. He didn't know which, but thought he'd better call out to her, or she'd run right into his truck. He rolled his window down. "Hello, Julia." She squeaked and jumped to a stop, whipping her gaze up to him. Dazzling eyes, the color of pure blue sky, went round in alarm. She blinked, and he stared, momentarily stunned himself to be thinking of brown eyes instead. He pressed those thoughts away. "Oh, my goodness! I don't know where my head was." Julia's voice broke the remainder of his daydreaming. She had encircled her throat with a hand. "Scared the living daylights out of me. Why are you just sitting there in the street?" "Sorry to scare you. I was just deciding what to do next. No parking." He swung his hand up and down the street. "Oh, I see. I rarely come over here, but had some paperwork to give my uncle. I'm leaving." She pointed to her green Valiant. "You can take my place." He shouldn't want her to leave. He wanted to get to know her better. But tonight wasn't the night. He had too much on his mind and needed to be alone with a drink, or several. By the look on her face, she was contemplating something too. More time with him? "How about we take a little drive? By the time we're back, something will have opened up. Or you can take over my parking place." Bronc considered her offer. What was wrong with him? Last week he would have jumped at the chance for more time with this pretty girl. She must have detected his hesitation. "Please? It's so pretty at dusk. Always so peaceful. I love to see the trees look all silhouette-y in the coming night.
Bronc laughed. Silhouette-y? Is that even a word? Isn't it? She laughed with him. He studied her. What would it hurt to put off a whiskey for another hour if he could spend time with the girl he'd called dibs on with his brother? He'd been drunk, but he hadn't forgotten. Jump in.
Thank you, God,
Julia prayed in her mind. She'd just been trying to figure a way to keep Bronc from going to the bar. Maybe tonight this diversion would be enough. Bronc eased back onto the river road. Where to? Julia racked her brain. It wasn't like she had an actual destination in mind. A lot of good all her schooling had done her. She was caught flat-footed.
You choose.
He nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. What could he be thinking? Feeling awkward, she smoothed her dress against her legs. Last time she'd goofed by bringing up the recovery home to Brand. This time she would be smarter. Take an interest in what makes him tick. Invite him to church. Be a real friend. But instead she blurted, "So, where's Brand?" The smile he had been flashing died a sudden death. She cringed. I just figured with him having just arrived, the two of you would still be catching up. Bronc graced her with a lopsided grin. Attractive as all get out. He and Brand certainly were handsome men. He's learning how to harvest. Dad has him in his web.
Don't like your dad?
He sighed. Not much to like. Bronc aimed the truck down a side street and putted along slowly. She thought he'd take her down the river road a ways. Looked like he was keeping them in the area. Like what? Long story that I'm sure would bore you.
I thought we might get to know each other. I'm all ears.
He glanced at her. She smiled her happy smile, wanting to keep him out longer. Too bad Brand wasn't here to help her. Even though she didn't know him well, she knew innately that Brand would want to keep his brother sober. Bronc sighed. Tonight's not the best night for that. How about I drive you back and you can go on about your business? She didn't know him well enough to judge, but it was either now or never. She'd been taught the direct approach was best. Last time she'd allowed her attraction to Brand to pull her off track. Not tonight.
I'd like to invite you to church with me tonight.
The look on Bronc's face would have been comical if she wasn't serious. Well, this is Wednesday. Deciding to play with him a little, she grinned.
Yes, it is.
Not Sunday? Bronc made a few more turns, passing the ramshackle homes of Locke's tiny community to arrive back at Al the Wop's. He swung up next to her vehicle and backed, parallel parking in the only space that had opened up, which happened to be right behind her car.
That's true. We have a service on Wednesday evenings for young people. Kind of our own personalized sermon. You would love it.
Well, she really didn't know if he would, but she had to start somewhere with him. You think so, huh? Maybe another time. I have plans for tonight.
Drinking?
She bit down on her lip, wishing she hadn't said that. Judging him wasn't going to help him.
And I'm sure you had other things planned as well.
Carrying on, she added,
Maybe next week? Brand's invited too.
Bronc sneered at his brother's name. Did they not like each other? Or was it just that Brand worked at keeping Bronc away from his addiction? Either way, if she were to help Bronc, she'd have to be careful not to cause a rift between the two.
It's fine if he's not available. I'd love to have you join me.
His eyes brightened a little at that.
Just think on it, okay?
She wanted to say, pray about it, but held her tongue.
Meet me at the Grace Community Church in Lodi. I'll watch for you. Service starts at 6.
He opened his mouth to speak, but she didn't want him to decline.
Okay, good to see you. She bounded toward her car, then said over her shoulder, See you next week. Before Bronc could close his gaping mouth, she hopped in her car, ground a few gears, and pulled out. She looked in the rearview mirror, seeing Bronc still sitting in his truck as she eased away. His palm flashed with a wave goodbye. A wave of sickening déjà vu hit her, and in an instant she was reliving the moment she twisted around in the back seat of her parents' car to watch her brother wave goodbye and jog into his UC Berkeley dorm. That was the last time she saw him alive. She swallowed down a hard lump. He was gone, but Bronc was alive. His future, not yet set in stone. She had fallen apart, picked herself up, and gone to school to design an alcohol recovery program. Temperance for Life Ministries existed to give other families hope before it was too late. She glanced again in her rearview mirror. Bronc pulled out and started following her. Her heart did a little flip. Had he decided to join her at church tonight after all? Was it the Lord's sweet providence that had led her to drop off temperance program flyers to her uncle tonight? Sure, it was a long shot that he would hand out flyers for a recovery home at his bar. But he was a reasonable man, and he knew when people were in trouble. But maybe the Lord's main goal was to orchestrate this very moment with Bronc. Julia drove down the river road toward Walnut Grove, peeking every few seconds at Bronc's truck behind her. Was this really happening? And then Bronc hung a right and headed over the drawbridge to the west riverbank. She dug her fingernails into the steering wheel, willing the pickup to come back. But Bronc's taillights flashed and he headed south. She gazed after him, awash in disappointment. All she could do at this point was pray for him and hope he'd join her next week. The blast of a horn startled her, wrenching her attention to the truck in the opposite lane ahead of her. What was this guy's problem? The truck whizzed by on her left. She caught a glimpse of the driver. Brand. Now her heart really did lurch. Should she turn around? But she'd just gotten on the levee, and there wasn't a good spot. Behind her, she saw Brand pull into a side street and make a U-turn. Before she knew it, he was on the levee behind her. She kept her eyes peeled for the next safe place to stop and took advantage of a wide shoulder on a curve. Before she could throw her car into neutral and turn off the engine, Brand was at her window. His face was lined with worry. Rolling her window down, she gave him a matching frown. Hi, Brand. Is everything all right? Have you seen my brother? She nodded. He was about ready to go into Al's for a drink. I talked him into a drive. Then I invited him to church. She scrunched her shoulders. He declined. Brand grimaced. Yeah, he didn't like the idea of church any more than his brother did. She had her work cut out for her if she was going to reach these two for Christ. Their lives depended on it. He was behind me for a mile or so, then just went across Walnut Grove Bridge and headed south from there. Does he know people in Ileton or Rio Vista? Brand yanked his hat off and whacked it against his thigh, then ran a hand through his hair. I don't know this area, or the people. Are there bars there? Maybe he's going somewhere I wouldn't know where to find him. Why would he do that? Because he knows I'll come after him. It's what I do in Wyoming. To make sure he gets home safely after drinking? He nodded, then sighed. Ah, Brand, you're such a champion. That's what she'd call him. Champ. He snuck away from the ranch. No one saw him leave. He cursed, then eyed her. Sorry. An apologetic gaze made her pulse speed. How was it possible for this twin to stir her womanly senses while the other only elicited concern? This man and his kindness appealed to her in ways she couldn't explain. It's fine. I hear those words plenty, believe me. I try not to judge. She grinned at him a little sheepishly, and he unleashed a smile so magnificent She was glad she was sitting. They gazed at each other for long seconds until both their smiles fell and only stares remained. He dropped his eyes from hers first, as if he was guilty for even staring. His fingers gripped her window. She could tell he was about to push away and walk back to his truck. "Tonight, we need to find Bronc. But soon, would you join me at church on Wednesday evening?" By the look on his face, his answer would be a flat no. On a Wednesday? Wednesday services are for the younger crowd. It's fun and uplifting. Lots of singing. It seems to me you deserve it. His eyebrows arched. She caught him off guard. Deserve it? The look on his face told her he'd think it a punishment, not a reward. Well, you're always looking after your brother. Maybe it's time you look after yourself. Those brows flattened to the top of his eyes so fast, you'd think she'd just asked him to rustle some cattle, or worse. She softened her voice. Do you ever look after yourself, Brand? He shuffled back a step. Forgive me. Your mind is on your brother, as it should be. He cleared his throat. Yeah, I need to go find him. He headed south, you say? If he went alone, he'd probably get lost. Not that it was hard to follow the river, but still. Can I help you find him? We could park my car, and I could go with you. His eyes shifted away from her to the river. He seemed to be contemplating. Before he could decline, she jumped back in. You don't know the area. I could help. He brought his gaze back to her. You have plans. I go every Wednesday evening. I can miss one. Won't your dad worry? He might, though not likely. She'd been an adult for a long time. She shook her head in response. Where shall I park Gumby? Gumby? He barked a laugh. Yes, my car. It's green. She wanted to say, duh, but didn't dare. You don't think Gumby is creative for a green valiant? No. Ha! I'll have you know it took me a whole day to come up with that nickname. A chuckle rolled out from his chest, deep and appealing. Okay, sunshine. There's a bank up ahead. They're closed now, so it should be fine to use one of their parking spaces. Sunshine? The nickname made her heart soar. It was just an off-the-cuff kind of name, and he'd probably used it because he'd forgotten hers. But the facts didn't keep her heart from flipping. I'll meet you there. While she rolled up her window, she watched him in her side mirror walk back to his truck. Cowboys really do saunter, don't they? She couldn't seem to stop staring until he jumped into his truck, then waited for her to move first. And a gentleman. She parked Gumby and jogged to the passenger side of his truck. He was already out of his side and opening the door for her. He grasped her elbow and helped her in. My goodness, even the church boys weren't this gentlemanly. They really made them special in Wyoming. After getting her settled, Brand drove them back to the Walnut Grove Bridge and crossed. About how far away is the next town? Ileton? About 10 miles away. Then Rio Vista, another 6-ish after. 6-ish? You make that up? Don't you use that? He chuckled. No, it's either 6 or it's not. Not true. She grinned at his profile. Sometimes it's like 5 3/4 miles, or basically 6-ish. Okay, you got me there. He let silence reign for only a few seconds. She was grateful Brand was the more talkative brother. So tell me, Julia, how long have you lived in the area? Ah, so he did remember her name. All my life. Where were you born? Sacramento Mercy Hospital. He grinned. That's specific. Well, you asked. So I did. His grin slid off his face, and a frown appeared. How many bars in Ileton? She understood Brand's worry completely. I'm not really sure, but there are a few restaurants that have bars in them. We could start there, and then maybe ask about others. He nodded, obviously distracted. Did he even hear her answer? See, right there, told her a lot. Brand, I don't know you well, but I do know you're usually chattier than this. Do you want to talk about it? Is there something more going on with your brother? His gaze shot to her, then back to the windy river road. You can talk to me. It won't go anywhere. She let the offer hang in the air, praying this man would let her in. Chapter 15. Brand wanted to open up to Julia, but he didn't know where to begin or how much to reveal. Bronc is, or has been, drinking too much, she finished for him. Oh, yes, too much. More than usual, Dad says. He's worried, and if he's worried, there is something seriously wrong. Well, of course he's worried. He wouldn't be a dad if he didn't worry some. Brand scoffed. And that means... Brand didn't feel like stirring up that hornet's nest. He took the winding turns carefully, the moonlight reflecting off the river so close. He could almost touch it. I'm worried that after Bronc drinks tonight, he'll end up in the drink. Wait, no, I'm confused. What does that have to do with your dad? Nothing. Are you trying to confuse me? You're all over the place. I'm worried. Yes, I understand that. I am too. Why? Believe it or not, Brand, I care. I may not know you guys well, but He forced a smile, not sure where to take this conversation. Think we're handsome devils and can't stay away from us? She giggled. The tinkling sound lightened his loathsome. I may think that, but it has nothing to do with this conversation. Back to your dad. He dropped the smile. He didn't want to talk about his dad. Bronc was enough to concern himself with right now. He had to find him. He let the conversation drift off. Brand, you okay? He had to give her something, or she wouldn't let it go. Dad wasn't there for us. Was he mimicking what he'd heard his brothers say, or did he really feel that way? He gripped the steering wheel tighter. Dad would never change the way he feels about you. Parents love their kids. At least good ones do. And you and Bronc turned out too well to come from bad parenting. Wow. How can you say that, knowing Bronc's an alcoholic? Well, it's my job to notice people, and their hurts, habits, and hang-ups. So, can you tell me how your dad wasn't there for you? What about your mom? No, Mom. She died giving birth to Bronc and me. Dad raised us. Or tried to. So, you do understand he tried. Well, that's good. I'm worried about your mom. That had to be tough. It's a major part of what's wrong with Bronc. He was the last one born. Dad didn't take Mom to the hospital, so we were born at home. She died with Bronc still between her legs. Dad left her in the bedroom just long enough to let the doctor in. But still, she died alone. Julia had gone still and quiet. Brand glanced at her. Her eyes were wet with tears. Oh, Brand, I'm so sorry. Her voice was thick with emotion. To grow up under that burden. It hit Bronc hard early on. Our brothers blamed us, or him, for killing her when we were younger. Bronc has more of a tender heart than you'd imagine. Julia gasped. I better not meet your older brothers. He jerked his head briefly in her direction, surprised. Why? She raised her fist in a boxer's stance. "I'm pretty good with my fists." He crunched his nose and shook his head. "What's so funny?" Her lips turned up in a smile. "You? You're going to take on my brothers? You've seen us, right?" "I'm serious, Brand. I will give them a piece of my mind at the very least." He was grinning now. This girl was really something. "Well, sunshine, I'll let you." He laughed. Slowing the truck as he came into Ileton, Brand glanced around. "Where to first?" "My beer room is right there on the right." "He's not into beer. Who serves whiskey?" "Dunno. Let's drive through town, look for his truck." He nodded. "That makes sense. Not a very big burg, I'll take it. All the river towns are small." As he cruised slowly through town, Julia took up where she left off, just as open as ever. It amazed him how she dug ugly information out of him with such kindness and courage. "Tell me about your ranch in Wyoming. Are all your other brothers there?" "No. My third brother, Clay, trains smoke jumpers around the country. He's based in Missoula now, he and his wife. Trevor, Colt, and Hunter all live on the ranch. Trev and Colt run the ranch, along with Colt's fiancée, Riley. Hunter is a veterinarian in Sundance." "Is Clay the only married brother?" "Yep. But Colt's wedding is coming up. We're going back home for that. Hunter's asked his girlfriend to marry him, but the date's not set yet. His fiancée is a deputy sheriff in Sundance." "Oh, wow. That's quite a job for a woman." "So Trevor isn't married yet?"
"Trevor?" he snorted. "Well, he does his work. Don't think he even knows women exist anymore." He could feel her stare rest on him.
"You're joshing."
"No, seriously. He had girlfriends in high school, but they're only a distraction he can't afford now, with all the work he has to do." Julia arched her eyebrows, looking skeptical. "Put it to you this way," Brand said. "A few years ago, Trevor was asked by the town council to escort an aspiring actress around town. It was sort of a tour guide, personal protection gig for a day. Trev grumbled, but he did it. She was so smitten with him, she wanted to snatch him up and take him back to Hollywood with her. At the end of the day, he politely took her back to Gillette to fly out. Refused to stay in touch."
"Wow, that's quite a story."
"Truth. We brothers met her. Any one of us would have grabbed her up in a heartbeat. To watch Trevor essentially ignore her made you wonder what was wrong with his brain. I wanted to disown him as a brother." She snickered.
"How old were you?"
"Senior in high school." She fell at Trevor's feet, and Bronc and I fell at hers. He chuckled. "It was quite a year, and it wasn't the first or last time Trevor shunned a beautiful woman."
"Really? There were others?"
"Lots. But soon after the actress debacle, he started to send Colt into town to fetch things, instead of going himself. Colt ended up with all the ladies chasing him instead." Brand laughed outright. "They still do. But you should see Riley, his fiancée, take them on. They've met their match, and then some."
"I'm sure you and Bronc must be in their scopes."
He shrugged. "Bronc and I are complicated."
"Because you take care of him and don't make any time for yourself?"
"If you had a twin, you would do the same." "So, do you have siblings?" Julia went silent. He glanced her way. She looked stricken.
"It's just me,"
she said in a small voice. He opened his mouth to ask more, but caught a glimpse of a pickup truck. Was that wrong color? Nope, Bronc's not here. The more they searched, the more Brand worried. Rebecca had told him horror stories about this river road.
Every year, too many people missed a turn or two and were found later in their cars at the bottom of the river. He could feel it in his soul that Bronc was alive, that he needed to find his twin before that outcome changed. Bronc ran a hand down his face, swiping the sweat from his brow and whiskey from his mouth. The place was packed with people and was hot as Hades. The whiskey wasn't helping. Not fast enough, anyway. Try as he might to forget, all Bronc could think of was Norman. The man was going to fight his leukemia. Great. But why should Norman have leukemia in the first place? He was as good a man as they come. Why would God give him cancer when he was one of his own? That was the main problem with this God thing. If God was so magnanimous, why did he cause pain and suffering in this world, especially to those who believed in him? Norm wasn't the first professed Christian Bronc had known to have a life-threatening affliction. Why did these people keep believing in a God who didn't automatically fix their problems? He pressed a thumb and forefinger into his eyes. He should be drinking more and thinking less. He flagged the bartender and pointed at the empty shot glass in front of him. A few seconds later, a full glass slid into view. "Thanks." He tipped his head back and let the fire slide down his throat. That shot felt good, calmed his nerves and his shaky hands. He signaled the barkeep again and poured the next full glass down his gullet. He wanted to forget Norm, the hyacinth, the mogul, everything. But instead of quieting, his thoughts shifted to Shell, batting her eyes at that sleaze Anderson. The whiskey in Bronc's gut began to burn. He'd never admit it to anyone else, but this was jealousy, pure and simple. Had to be, since he sure as heck was ready to give that arrogant cretin a knuckle sandwich for how close he had sat to her, and how he'd made her laugh. Such a precious, melodious sound. Bronc grumbled into his glass. "What's up?" the bartender asked, wiping down the bar in front of him. "What do you mean?" "Never seen you here before, but I'm pretty good at reading faces. Yours tell me you're having a lady trouble." Bronc waved him off. "All bartenders think that." "Spill." Bronc glared. "Not interested in spilling." "You'll feel better. I'm a good listener." "Gad. Bartenders leave you alone where I'm from. Don't figure they're psychologists." "Not very good at their jobs, then." The man stared him down, picked up a glass to dry it, then another, and waited, his eyes never leaving Bronc's. Well, the only way to get rid of this guy was to spill, he guessed. He'd never see him again anyway. "I got things on my mind is all." "Don't we all?" "What things?" Fine. He'd go for the obvious stuff. "Just found out my boss, actually, my grandfather has leukemia." The barkeep grimaced. "Bad luck. Sorry, man." "Yeah." "And?" He wasn't going to let this go. "And what?" "The girl." Bronc growled this time, catching the attention of the guys on either side of him. Throwing them each a glare, they turned away slightly. He could say, "What girl?" but the nosy bartender would just keep digging. "Two girls." "Two girls? You like them both? You can't decide?" "Sort of." "Spill." "Stop with the spill thing, will you?" The man picked up another glass, his eyes still focused on Bronc. "Drat." "Fine. You're going to give me advice if I tell you my thoughts?" "Sure." "Well, what could it hurt?" "Instant attraction to one," he shrugged. "Church girl. Beautiful blonde with blue eyes. Innocent, delicate. Want to know more?" "The other?" "Been working with her for 10 months and hadn't really noticed her much, other than she's A heck of a hard worker. She slung manure, forks hay, rides better than most men, drives truck when we pick up bales, and she is best friends with a bull. Okay, you got me. That last remark. The man grinned and set the glass down to listen more carefully. Hey, man, a beer down here, a man at the far end of the bar yelled. Be right back. Be ready to explain the bull comment. What was he doing? He should leave. Could figure this out on his own. He started to slip off the bar stool when his interrogator returned. Okay, go on. Bronc settled back in. He'd give him this story, then leave. Smiling, it always made him smile to think of how Tank adored Shell. He pushed through the whiskey to order his muddled thoughts. The bull's in love with Shell. Hold on. Shell? Shelly. I call her Shell. Ah, 'cause she's one of the guys. Smart guy. He nodded. Whenever Tank, that's the bull, gets cast in the pasture, Shell's the only one who can get him up again. Talking slower so he wouldn't slur, he went on. Without her, it takes 6 cowboys to get him to his feet, and most don't want to be anywhere near him. He's mean, like most bulls when their girls are in the pasture with them, if you know what I mean. Bronc waggled his eyebrows. The bartender laughed. Go on. How does she do it? Well, I don't know, really. She gets low, eye level, touches his neck, and Bronc shrugged. Sweet talks him. Go on. He grinned. Well, she coos to him like he's a big baby, strokes his face and neck, scratches between his eyes. Typical smitten male, putty in the hands of a good woman. Good woman, huh? Showing your hand some? Bronc thought about that comment, a frown pulling at his brows. Go on. Should he go on? May as well. Then she pulls him up by the ear, and he follows her lead, easy as you like. She takes him to his favorite tree and leaves him. He watches her walk off like he's been spurned, and she just broke his heart. We think he begins plotting the next jackrabbit hole to step into right then and there. It's ridiculous and hilarious. Every time? Every time. Wow. That's something. Okay, what changed? What? Don't waste my time. I have other patrons. What changed that made you notice her all of a sudden? How did he guess that? He'd have to rethink the talents of bartenders. Today, Bronc felt his blood pressure rise. A drink. He needed another. Pointed at his empty glass. The bartender shook his head. Go on. He was going to cut him off until he spilled? Fine. A real estate developer visited the ranch today, and you would have thought it had been Elvis Presley himself the way Shell was oogling him. The bartender's lips twitched. Jealousy? What, was he jealous? She acted like a teenager, seriously, all smiles and laughter. He groaned. It was downright embarrassing. For you or for her? Should have been for her. A flash of lightning lit up the dark bar, shining through the small window next to the mirror, and a crash of thunder followed. Rain began to patter on the tin roof. Then the clouds let loose, and it poured. The racket started to give Bronc a headache. Wow, noisy in here when it rains. I should probably head home. She'll be waiting at the gate. I don't want her to get drenched. She'll? You mean Shelley will be waiting up for you? At what gate? Your ranch? Yeah, Bronc said matter-of-factly, wondering why the bartender looked baffled. He'd never given it much thought. She'd just always been there whenever he spent the night out drinking. You don't find that strange? Bronc halted, not sure what to think. He guessed he should have long since considered this, just took her comfort and protection for granted. She'll do this every time? Every time. Geez, man, she's got it bad. You never figured that out? Bronc's throat tightened. How self-centered must he be to have never noticed what Shell had done for him? You're a drunk, that's why. The words landed hard in his mind. The drunks, he knew, never gave two rips about others. Had he become like them? I gotta go. Gotta check on her. Guilt squeezed at his throat, causing the lump to grow. Was that the first time he'd ever even thought that? Wait a minute. What about the church girl? The question snapped him out of his stupor. Who? You never told me her name. Church girl. The one you were so attracted to. Bronc had to get back to Shell, make sure she was safe and dry. He stood upright and looked the barkeep in the eye with a new clarity. Who? Chapter 16. Brand was frantic, squinting through the windshield wipers and sodden side windows to look for Bronc's pickup. We've looked all over Isleton and Rio Vista now. Bronc isn't here. Where else could he be? Julia frowned. Could be we missed him at some point. With the side roads and all this rain? Brand sucked in one breath after another, trying to slow his heart rate. You're right. Let's go back. He's probably tucked in a Wimpy's by now. Julia patted him on the arm. Yes, probably. Who knows? We might meet up in time to join him for a burger. Her tone was light, hopeful, but her fingertips lingered on Brand's arm, steadying him. Wind and rain had whipped the river into chaotic swells. Brand pulled over onto a frontage road overlooking the river, waiting for the rain to subside a bit. After several calming breaths, he tore his gaze from the turbulent scene to look at Julia. Thank you for helping me. Deep down, I know he's all right. I'd feel it if he wasn't. Brand crammed himself into the seat and dropped his hands to the bottom of the steering wheel. I've been so anxious tonight. I've barely given you any consideration. That was rude. I'm not who I am. Julia gave him a soft smile. She slid closer to him. He was used to watching for opportunity, so he knew what she was about to offer. Locking one hand to the seat back, he anchored himself for his desire to copy her move. He needed to remain a gentleman, not just because his twin had claimed interest in her, but because she was a religious woman, probably curious but most likely pure. Her tiny hand reached up to caress his cheek gently, her eyes glimmering in a show of sympathy. He wanted to reciprocate, to slide his own fingers down over her soft skin. She smelled like heaven, roses in full bloom and something else. Innocence. Time passed as they stared into each other's eyes, sky blue to hazel green, until his hand lifted without his permission, doing what he'd been thinking of, cradling her face in his palm. He fingered some wisps of hair, then tucked them behind her ear. It wasn't enough. He still itched to feel all the silk. So he did. Reaching for the top of her head, he trailed his fingers down her long, straight hair. Julia. His voice was thick. He wanted to kiss her. The urge, strong, barely controllable. But had her sweet caresses only been out of concern for his plight? She seemed to be holding her breath, as if she wanted the same thing he did. Did she? Was he reading her right? When she came close and tilted her head up, was it for his lips, or to look him in the eye? He leaned back out of her space. Surprised and blushing, she pulled back, apology in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me. I was too close, wasn't I?" He didn't want her to be embarrassed for something he wanted, probably more than she did, unless she hadn't even been after a kiss. Where had his ability to read women gone? "No, Julia, don't apologize." He caressed her cheek. But anything he said now was only likely to embarrass them both. His brows set low against his eyes. The corners of his mouth sagged. He had nowhere to go with this. "Brand, let me ask you something." His spine stiffened. Nothing good ever came from those words, especially not when debating a kiss. At a loss, he only nodded. "Have you ever considered you aren't the only one who loves your brother?" That took him aback. "Okay, sure. Dad does, and our brothers. I'm not talking about human beings. Animals? I'm talking about God. God can help you with your brother. He loves him more than you do." Brand sat back, far out of range, bristling. "Doubtful. I'm his twin." She stretched to caress his cheek again, then dropped her hand in her lap, scooting back herself. By the look in her eyes, he wouldn't like her next comment. "Who do you think made your twin?" Heat began at the base of his skull and rose. So she'd been debating how to have this conversation. Not a kiss. Now he should be embarrassed. But he wasn't. He was miffed. "Can we scrap the God talk? I need to find my brother." Brand rotated forward to face the windshield. The rain had let up a little. He put the truck in gear and headed back, the way they'd come. Bronc drove carefully along the river road. It was raining pretty good right now, and though he wouldn't call himself skunk drunk, he knew his judgment was off. It was about quitting time at Wimpy's. He could head over and let Tony drive him the rest of the way home. Better to get to the ranch in one piece than end up in the river, and Tony was good about handing him off to Shell. Sure enough, he pulled into Wimpy's parking lot in time to see Tony opening an umbrella and heading for his car. The bar would still be open, but the restaurant had long since locked down tight. Bronc parallel parked his truck along a nearby fence. Tony looked worn out. Must have been a big burger crowd tonight. Bronc had never known about Wednesday night church service before, that the church people might grab a meal afterward. Julia's church must not be the only one offering a midweek sermon. Tony's umbrella sagged as he leaned against his car door and dug in his pocket for the keys. Bronc knew what it felt like to be that bone tired. He wasn't about to put a fresh burden on the man. No, he could get himself home. He'd gotten himself this far, hadn't he? Just as he was about to start up the truck and head out, the light for Tony's headlights flashed through Bronc's window, half blinding him. Tony's car creeped toward him and parked just ahead. Out came the umbrella, with Tony underneath it, heading for Bronc's door. Grimacing, Bronc rolled down his window and popped his head out. "Hey, buddy," Tony said. "You okay? Been drinking? I can smell it." Bronc hated when people said that. It had been a good 30 minutes since he'd had a drink. Could Tony really smell it on him still? But Tony didn't deserve a tongue-lashing, so Bronc just nodded his agreement. "Leave your truck right there. I'll take you home. Come on." Bronc thought about wielding his way out of his ride home, but he ran too great a risk of slurring his words. So he rolled his window back up, got out, and locked the door behind him. It took concentration to amble behind Tony to his car, but Bronc was surprisingly steady tonight. Maybe he could get his dad and brother to back off if he only drank as much as he had tonight. The problem with that was less booze meant more guilt over what he'd done. The more he drank, the more it dulled the pain. As Tony's wipers thumped their rhythm, it was all Bronc could do not to nod off. He had to know if Shell would be there, at the gate, in the blinding rain, waiting for him. So many times in the past he hadn't remembered getting back home, much less ending up in his own bed. He had to know what Shell did with him once he was in her care, why she did it, and how she managed to heft a 200-plus-pound man when she probably weighed 7 dozen less. Tony's car turned left, splashing through puddled potholes, and slowed to a halt. "Here we are, my man," Tony said cheerily. "Thanks again, Tony Meister." He laughed. "Always did like that nickname. Sadly, you never used it when you're sober." "Well, would you look at that?" Sure enough, there she stood, wrapped up tight in her wool-lined jacket, boots, and the largest bright red umbrella he'd ever seen. Her cowboy hat was pulled clear down to her nose, so he couldn't see her eyes, but he imagined them. Dark chocolate brown, wide, concerned, never judgmental. Behind her sat her dad's pickup truck, not one of Norm's. Navy blue, conservative, but solid, just like the man who owned it. Bronc grimaced. Did she just borrow his truck, or did her dad always know when the drunk next door needed rescuing? Bronc's throat tightened, but he couldn't decide if it was from embarrassment or anticipation. He slowly opened the door, trying not to stare too much. She'd know he wasn't blasted if he looked her in the eye, so he swung down, landing a little cockeyed. Not on purpose, so he was a bit drunk, but not much. She raced forward and caught him by the forearms with startling strength. "Hey there, big guy. You doing okay?" Had she always used that smooth voice on these nights? It compounded his confusion over her. Not knowing what to say, he didn't speak, which must have been normal because she continued to rattle on, not stopping for answers. "Can you walk to your truck? Or do we need a little help?" Bronc ground his back teeth together. He wasn't a child. No need to treat him like one. "Come on, put your arm around my shoulders." He did, curious about the strength of her, or maybe the feel of her. "That's it. Now, left foot first, like that. Now the right foot." He could walk without her help, but he was determined to find out how she handled him. Keep your anger in check, he reminded himself. Waving Tony off, he did as she said, and soon he was standing at the open passenger door of the pickup truck. "Up you go!" As he leaned in, lifting his foot to the running board, she gave him a hefty shove. He landed face first in the middle of the seat, popping his hat off. Dang, but that girl had power. He'd laugh if he wasn't so furious. At what? Himself? Her? Whichever it was all he could do to push himself upright on the seat. She carefully placed each boot on the floorboard, pulled him to a semblance of a sitting position, then swung the door closed and hightailed it around to her side. She stuffed her now closed umbrella behind the seat and jumped in. He expected her to start the truck and drive him back to the cabin. But no. With a practiced move, Shell scooted toward the middle of the bench seat, discarded her hat, then pulled him toward her until his face was planted in the crook of her neck. He was stunned. He could tell she'd done this before. One big inhale through his nose and his muscles tightened. She smelled of wholesomeness, sandalwood, and hay. He'd never been this close to her, that he remembered. So he never had the privilege to pull in a breath of her essence before now. He sucked in another, a little too exuberantly. "Can't catch your breath there, sweet man? Here, let's shift you." She faced him a little more and pulled him closer so his neck was straighter. More contact than bliss. He wondered if she would settle him into her chest next. Curious and enormously wound up, he had a hard time waiting for her next move. Since he was pretending to be soused, he felt a little silly, truth be known. "Comfy now? You okay, my sweet cowboy?" Those words knocked the silly right out of him. My sweet cowboy? Should he let her continue? Now he felt like he was deceiving her if he didn't tell her the truth. He was getting more sober by the minute. She began to hum, then sing, and if he had any hope of moving before, his bone and sinew all melted together as her breathy, sweet voice filled the cab. He knew that song. It was an older Eddie Arnold ballad. He listened as she sang. She knew every word. Take me in your arms and hold me like I've been holding you in my heart. Muscles that hadn't relaxed since he was a kid began to unwind. Her neck was warm against his lips. Had he ever kissed her there before? He wondered. She must have done this for him dozens of times. What had he done, besides remain passed out? Once she was finished with the song, he thought sure she'd shift him away and drive him home. Wrong again. She started to sing In the Still of the Night. Somehow he knew she sang that one to him often. Once it was finished, she began to talk all whispery-like, as if she didn't want to hurt his head with her voice, which she could never do, he realized. Why hadn't he paid attention to her sweet voice before? Because she doesn't use it during the day. She hollers at the cattle. I'll take care of you, Bronc Buster. Just you and me, right here. Let it rain. Let the dark creep in. It doesn't matter. None of it matters. Bronc Buster? He loved that name, even more now than before. It fit. He wanted to answer her back, but knew that would end this. He didn't know what this was, but he knew he didn't want it to end. She began to sing again. This time it was Andy Williams, Moon River. Ah, another ballad. Moon River, wider than a mile, I'm crossing you in style someday. Shelley had a beautiful, lyrical voice, one that could settle the most anxious of men. Or bulls, he realized. Wondered if that's how she got Tank to adore her so much. He could sure understand that. Now that he thought of it, she gave of herself to everyone. Her time, her talents, her kind heart. He didn't understand women like Brand did, but he was pretty sure a woman wouldn't invest her time with a drunk like him unless she cared about him. But why? Why indeed? Normally, thoughts like these would have him shooting off the seat and as far away as he could get. But he couldn't give himself away. He should put an end to this, though. It wasn't right. She'd been so good to him. He was still curious about how she got him home each night that he drank, but not enough to dupe her like this. Purposefully, he stirred in her arms. Oh, hey there. Are you awake? Her voice gave away her worry that maybe he had been all along. He coughed, then tested his voice. Yeah. Oh. Silence filled the cab. Only the continual pitter-patter on the roof filled the hollow. Bronc remained quiet, waiting to see what else she had to say. How long have you been awake? A trembling hand cupped his face and lifted it so his eyes could meet hers. Apprehension and maybe a little embarrassment showed there. Where am I? He lied, wanting to ease her worry. Their eyes remained locked. Hers kept widening, fanning her long black lashes up to her brows, showing her confusion, even longing, but mostly sadness. Was she sad their night was cut short, or for other reasons? You okay there, Rebel? A small smirk crept onto her face before she hid it away. He remembered the day he'd nicknamed her Rebel. It was his first workday at Harper West 10 months ago when he was tossing out hay to the cattle from the back of the ranch truck. He wanted her to drive the truck, not throw bales. She'd made him angry. He'd been angry all the time back then. And certainly he didn't want to be upstaged by a girl who wouldn't obey him. So he snapped at her, calling her Rebel. But he wondered if she'd notice he'd never used it the same way again. And tonight he realized what the nickname had become to him. He was awakening to the fact he'd begun to think of her as his little rebel. His little rebel joining him against the world. He drowned himself in alcohol because he didn't own his future. He was a mere shadow of his brothers, especially Brand, the smarter, more charming, more wiser twin. Bronc, the drunk, the loser of his family, the one constantly reprimanded for being lesser, and the one who'd killed their mom. As always, his heart cracked a little more at the memory. This was the dark hole he fell into when he thought too much. And right now, he didn't want to make this about him. "You okay?" he asked again. Shell shook her head, and he thought he'd get the chance to comfort her for a change, until she spoke and shattered his plan. "No. It's you who's not okay, Bronc. We should get you home and into bed." Shame filled him. She was well practiced at putting him to bed. 3 or 4 times a week? Drunk? He couldn't let her do this anymore. Couldn't be that man. No more, Shell. That had come out harsh. Her beautiful eyes flared wider. "What?" "No more taking care of me." He should say more, explain, but he didn't know how. Her body shuddered as she dissolved back into the seat. He hadn't meant to take his caregiver out in one verbal slice, but by the look of pain in her eyes, he may as well have taken a machete to her. It figured. She wasn't the first he'd done that to, or even the 10th. "Why?" Her voice was so small, he barely heard it. "You've put me to bed too often, Shell. I can't believe I let you do it." Her pretty mouth tilted down at the corners, eyes so vacant they looked gray instead of vibrant chocolate. His careless words had killed something in her. "What I mean is—" "Don't say it. I've overstepped. Can you get yourself to your cab in, all right?" She glanced at the doorless ranch truck parked just inside the gate. "Talking a mile a minute now." "I'll watch from here to make sure that you make it in one piece." He hadn't opened his mouth to change her mind, but she held up a hand. "Don't. I understand. I do. I'll see you tomorrow." She glanced at her watch. "Actually, later this morning." The ragged breath she'd dragged in between sentences scratched at his heart. What had he done? "Listen, Shell." She pressed her fingers over his mouth to stop him. The touch ignited his skin and shot sensations straight to his core. She seemed to feel it, too. Her fingers slid slowly off his mouth and over his chin as she quietly said, "Good night, Bronc." She turned away and moved quickly, jumping out of the truck and jogging around to open his door. Taking hold of his hand, she tugged to let him know now was the time to leave. The rain was still heavy enough to soak her before Bronc slid himself out of the truck. He faced the doorless truck, but couldn't take that first step away. He wanted more. Didn't know what that looked like, just more. Shell started back around to the driver's side, leaving him on his own. He shivered from more than the cold. Swung his door closed and stared through the window at her. He should walk away. He meant to, but his boots were rooted to the ground. He would not. could not, turn his back on her. She swung her door open to climb back in and glanced his direction. She froze, the current of understanding arcing between them. The rigidness in her expression softened. Her chest rose and fell, his entire existence held in that single breath. Then she rocked back to the ground and made her way around the grill toward him. The rain pelted down, plastering her hair to her silky skin, her eyes kind, her lips pressed into a solemn smile. Backlit by the headlights as she was a picture of otherworldly loveliness. She offered her hand at arm's length to lead him to the ranch truck. He deserved that, but he ached for more of her, all of her. Before he knew what he was doing, he had closed his fingers around her forearm and pulled her in close to his chest. Her face tilted up to meet his eyes. He pulled her in tighter. With the other hand, he pushed her damp hair out of her face. She blinked up at him, her dark lashes catching raindrops like they were dream catchers, snatching up all their shared dreams. Her eyes were warm, inviting. Leaning down, he pressed his lips to hers. They were slippery with rainwater, but still warm and delicious, and everything they promised to be. Chapter 17. It had been 3 days since the kiss, and Bronc hadn't seen Shelley on the ranch since. Not even at the harvest party last night to celebrate the milo, alfalfa, and field corn getting carted away. The workers told him she was around, doing her job as usual, which meant she was actively avoiding him. His pleasure was fast drying up to bitter regret. Well, her job was going to get a whole lot easier after today. He was headed back to Wyoming for Colt's wedding. Easier for her, harder for him, because Bronc had been keeping his own distance from Brand since ditching him that rainy night. Brand was still furious. It all seemed over the top. Hadn't Bronc gotten himself home safely without Brand chauffeuring him from door to door? But how was Bronc supposed to avoid his twin if they were all going to be stuffed into Clay's plane like sardines? Bronc zipped his suitcase closed. He dashed a glance at the bathroom door where Brand was holed up, then dropped to his knees beside the bed. Lord, this is Bronc. Don't have much time, just wanted to ask for Norm to do well with the chemo. Please keep the nausea away and have it kill that cancer. Thank you, amen. He'd just risen when Brand dashed out, not giving Bronc even a glance, and began pawing through his drawers for clean jeans. Without a word, Bronc dropped his suitcase by the door and headed to the ranch house. The lights were on, but somehow the place felt empty. Marie! He hollered up the staircase to silence in return. Norman! Rebecca shuffled to the top of the stairs, dragged 2 suitcases behind her. Your dad went to fill Alfred in on what needs to be completed while we're gone. I just finished packing. Norm and Marie are at their new spot, just past the bunkhouse. Ah, their new morning spot. It gave Norm peace to enjoy the breaking forth of God's light, as he put it. The two liked to scuttle off together ever since Norman had relented and started his chemotherapy treatments, and the tiredness and nausea hadn't set in yet. Their new dawn, they liked to call their new spot where they watched the sunrise. Hope for a future, Norm had said. Bronc wanted that for them as well. In fact, would make a habit of asking for it daily. Thanks. I'll get my bags once I talk to Norm. Brand is still packing. Bronc backed himself out of the house and jogged in the gray light around a clump of cattails to find the 2 little old people sitting in folding chairs. Thought I'd find you here. As was their new morning ritual, there sat Norm and Marie, sipping tea from big mugs and watching the sun peek over the east levee. Morning, son. Sleep well? Golden light shot across the fields from the horizon, creating a tight band of warmth hemmed in above by gray-black clouds. The sunrise would be short and sweet this morning. Sure. How about you? Feeling okay?" Norm wrinkled his nose.
"I'm a bit more achy, but I promised my bride here that I wouldn't give up."
Bronc came around to face them and smiled. "That's the spirit."
Me and Marie was just counting our blessings and admiring the legacy we're leaving behind when the good Lord takes us home.
Enough of that talk. This means you won't be selling to that sharpshooter that was here the other day?
Ah, he's all right, son. Just a bit on the slick side. But God can change all that. Don't you forget it. God can smooth out all our rough edges. And no, we'd never sell the place. It's in our blood and has been in the family for years. Not giving it up. Got kids, grandkids, and greats coming. Gonna pass it on.
Norman caught and held Bronc's eyes, and he could see the light shining behind Norman's, even though his skin was pale from the treatments.
Not the easiest place, mind you. Got dangers on all sides we gotta fight every winter. You seen that. But it's in my blood, my boy. So I'll do my best to farm it. It's in God's hands to save it, or not, from the floods. Kind of like he's doing with me. He'll fix me or he'll take me home. It's all up to him.
A lump the size of Texas formed in Bronc's throat. He scrubbed a hand down his face, catching any stray tears, looking away, coughed. "We were about to leave," he said in a strained voice, "as soon as Dad is back from talking to Alfred. I just wanted to say goodbye. Make sure you're going to be all right." That talk of great-grandkids got Bronc spinning his wheels after Shelley again. She knew he was leaving today. Sure, he'd be back, but seriously? She didn't even make an effort to say goodbye last night before he left. He wanted to jump in the truck and track her down, give her a thorough dressing down, but time was ticking off, and those dark clouds rolling in told him they would soon have bad weather to contend with. They needed to get going.
"Clouds have been gathering all morning,"
Norm said, grabbing his cane and starting to walk toward the house.
"It's about to rain. You need to skedaddle."
Marie folded their chairs to follow. Without a word, Bronc swept Norman up in his arms.
"Whoa, son. I've been walking pretty good lately with my cane. Let me down."
Bronc ignored his request and turned toward Marie. "I can come back for the chairs," she chortled. "I'm a whole lot younger than that old man you're carrying. I'm fine. Let's go." By the time the three of them made it back to the house, the clouds overhead gave way. His dad, Rebecca, and Brand all stood at the open front door, apparently waiting on him. When they saw he was carrying Norman, his dad opened the door wider, and they all moved out of the way. Bronc settled Norman in his favorite spot on the couch and stepped back.
"Be safe. Now go,"
Norman said to the four of them as they stood before him, suitcases all around. "You going to be all right until we get back?" Bronc asked.
"I'm fine, young man. Stop fretting over me. Have a good time. Congratulate Colt and Riley for us. Did you pack the gift Marie wrapped for them?"
Cord smiled.
"We got it, Norm. They will appreciate the extra gear for their rescues. Good choice. They'll probably get plenty of toasters."
He laughed, and they all joined him.
"When will Clay be at Franklin Field to pick you up?"
Bronc swallowed hard. Franklin Field was a local airfield with only one landing strip, used by ranchers and farmers who had private planes like Clay. His brother was an experienced pilot, but it all seemed a bit unsafe to him, especially in the rain.
"We need to get going."
Cord checked his watch.
"Clay should be touching down right about now. Let's go. Everyone have what they need?"
Bronc and Brand both nodded the same number of nods, then smiled identically. Norman chuckled, which made Brand and Bronc glance at each other. "Yep, ready," they said simultaneously. Even when they were at war, they were in sync. Bronc shot Brand another sideways glance. Feeling himself thaw a little, Brand turned to smile on Bronc, but his eyes were cold. Bronc's smile went slack. They said their goodbyes, then made their way to the crew cab truck, the one with doors. Brand opened the door for Rebecca, took a handkerchief out of his back pocket to clean the seat for her, then climbed in the back seat after Bronc. Cord tipped his hat toward Brand in appreciation, then put the truck in gear and crept over the first of the potholes. The truck heaved left, then right, rocking the twins' head together. Brand shoved Bronc away. Bronc raised his arm defensively. "Hey, what's your problem?" Rebecca turned in her seat to face them. "You two have been at each other's throat for days now. What's going on?" Cord glanced in the mirror, catching Bronc's eyes. The look a stern ice blue. Bronc looked away. He waited for Brand to say what was on his mind. When he didn't, he elbowed him, getting the same in return. "Knock it off," Cord said. "Thought you two were grown men." Their dad's terse words stopped their physical interaction, but identical frowns remained on their faces. Truth be told, Bronc wasn't worth the energy Brand was wasting to stay mad. It'd be better for both of them if Brand just let him self-destruct. Bronc was the one who'd done the unforgivable. Brand didn't deserve to be dragged into it. Bronc sighed and looked out the window. Brand elbowed him in the ribs. Bronc whipped his head in his direction. "What?" "You already know," Brand mouthed to Bronc. "Get over it," Bronc mouthed back. They glared at one another until Bronc looked away again. Brand could always outstare him. Did that make Brand the dominant one? He knew with twins there always was one, but he'd always figured it was him. Didn't angry and wild trump charming? The fact that he wanted to make amends so badly said a lot about who was in charge, and that sent him into a deeper funk. He needed a drink. The wipers thumped hard against the windshield, filling the silence with their relentless rhythm. "Are we going to be able to fly in these conditions?" Bronc asked, truly concerned for their safety. Cord glanced in the rearview mirror at him. "Clay will know what's safe. You should also pray about it, son. Give you some peace of mind." Bronc lifted his eyebrows non-committally and found something else to look at. Sure, he'd probably pray, in his head. His gaze landed on Brand, knowing his brother would be grinding his teeth over that comment. He was. Rebecca looked over her shoulder. "That's right, boys. God is in control of the weather, and your lives, for that matter." As much as Bronc liked Rebecca, the boys' comment always annoyed him. She was only a few years older, after all, but now wasn't the time to protest. "There it is." Cord nodded his head toward a couple of metal aircraft hangars that stood behind a whipping windsock. Small airplanes were parked one after the other, tied from their crankcases to the ground with steel cables. Two people came into view from under the eaves of a metal building. "There they are!" Rebecca squealed and waved. "Right over there!" And sure enough, Clay stood a full head taller than Peggy, his arm wrapped around her to protect her from the rain. They both waved back. Cord made a beeline for them and rolled his window down only enough to holler out at them without getting soaked. "Hey, son! Peggy! Good you made it safely. Is it safe to fly in this weather?" Clay refrained from rolling his eyes like he usually did when people asked if flying was dangerous. "We got here, didn't we?" he chuckled. Said like a man who made his living in the sky. Truth be told, Bronc related more to his daredevil brother Clay than anyone else in the family. But Clay's laughter didn't have the hard edge of a man spitting into the eye of the storm like it used to. There was genuine joy there, and it surprised Bronc and everyone in the truck. Clearly Clay's gloomy years were behind him. Despite the sour stomach booze had left, Bronc found himself smiling. Clay deserved the happy life he had now. He'd been through enough. "Park it at the end of the hangar, Dad," Clay pointed to show him. Cord eased forward to the parking spot. As they exited the truck and locked it up, Brand turned to face their father. "We should have brought my truck, Dad. Aren't they going to need the International back at the ranch? It's their only four-wheel drive." "Nah, don't want to leave your brand-new truck out here for the next week. This old beater truck isn't going to draw attention. Come on, let's get our stuff into the Comanche." 30 minutes later, the Comanche was loaded and Clay was finishing his pre-flight checklist. Bronc hunched, the curved fuselage wall at his side. This sure seemed like a fragile sort of aircraft to be able to haul 4 large men and 2 women, plus all their luggage. The hold in the back was packed tight, and there was barely any room between passengers. Bronc's stomach started churning. "Everybody ready?" Clay said over his shoulder. He looked so official with his headset and mouthpiece on. "We need to go now that there's a small break in the weather. Once we're above the clouds, you'll see the sun." He grinned, then leaned over and gave Peggy a kiss on the mouth. "Ready, honey?" "Yep. Take us out of here, Ace." Her smile was so big, Bronc could see the sun already. They both looked happy. Oh, good for Clay. Bronc needed a drink, badly. As Clay taxied them to one end of the tiny airstrip, Bronc squeezed his eyes shut. If he didn't watch, he'd be better off, especially since his gut was already rebelling from the alcohol he guzzled after the harvest party last night. The thought brought him back to Shell and the kiss, the warm, rain-slicked, gratifying kiss that still had his head spinning. She was usually at the ranch by dawn. Where had she been this morning? He wanted to give her instructions about what to do while they were gone. Oh, who was he kidding? He wanted to look in her eye, get a read on her, see if she was reeling from the kiss like he was. But that wasn't his only concern. The dang real estate mogul was. He needed to warn her to make herself scarce. He stewed over the tycoon coming back this week when he wasn't there to run him off. He gripped the arms of his seat instead of fisting his hands. "You okay?" Brand's breath hit him in the ear. He flinched, then nodded, hoping Brand would leave him be. He needed to calm himself down to keep from throwing up on Rebecca's neck, who was in front of him in the second row with their dad. Then he remembered. While Clay had gone over necessary information about their flight, he mentioned quiet herb bags in the pocket at the back of each seat. He should get one out just in case. But then Brand would know how bad he felt and start harping on him about his drinking again. And he planned to go drinking as soon as he could slip away. Brand glanced at his twin. The man was hung over yet again. He hoped they'd get through this flight without mishap. As turbulent as the trip might be because of the storm, Brand didn't have a good feeling about what kind of shape Bronc would be in by the end. One thing he knew for sure, if he threw up in these close quarters, he'd make everyone sick. "Here, suck on this." He handed Bronc a mint. He often gave them to his brother to settle his stomach the morning after binges. Lately, it was every morning. He reached behind Rebecca's seat and yanked out a quiet herb bag, cleverly named for a ghastly need. Just in case. Bronc glared at him, but quickly turned back toward the front. Clay was just starting down the airstrip and gaining speed. Bronc and Brand both tightened their holds on their seats until their knuckles were white. Dad and Rebecca didn't look much better, but Clay and Peggy were laughing as if they were sitting around the kitchen table. A few bumps and splashes, and they were airborne. The minute rainwater hit the windshield, it spread in all directions. No wonder windshield wipers weren't needed on a plane. Brand guessed they'd just blow right off anyway. The engine rumbled powerfully through the seat as they climbed, and soon Brand found himself smiling. A quick glance in Bronc's direction told Brand his brother was anything but thrilled. "You okay there, little brother?" Bronc's green face shifted from about to heave to furious in 1.2 seconds. Yeah, that always got to him. His glare would have disintegrated Brand had it been shot from Superman's eyes. But it did what he'd hoped. "Knock it off." Bronc's coloring came back, shifting to red. Good. He refocused his attention, watched as Clay took them above the clouds into bright sunshine. What a miracle. Amazing. Wow! It's beautiful up here, Clay, Rebecca shouted over the engine noise. The clouds look like puffy cotton balls. They did. A whole blanket of cotton. About how long will it take to get to Wyoming? She asked. Got somewhere to be, Clay shouted over his shoulder at her, then laughed. Peggy joined him. Sundance? We'll get there eventually. Plan on 7 hours or so, depending on stops for fuel and weather, especially over the mountain ranges. Oh, wow. Brand hadn't thought about the length of time in the air. Poor Bronc. If his brother survived this trip, he'd have to watch him at the other end. He'd be trying to slip off to the bars the first chance he got. As memory served, Julia talked about how alcoholics relied on booze even more to calm themselves under stressful situations. Alcoholic. The word sounded so brutal. He'd said it to Bronc's face once before, but it unnerved him then and rattled him now. Still, in his conversation with Julia, Brand saw how she applied the term to Bronc not as an insult, but rather a diagnosis, with a heart for healing. It seemed to be a calling for her, and he wondered why. He gave her credit for wanting to help, but why did it have to be with a faith-based recovery program? Why God? Why indeed? The thought came into his brain, startling him, shaking him up. He'd either continue to say no to God or step off his current track and start saying yes. Deep down, he knew Julia would only choose a godly man for her future. The stakes were suddenly much, much higher for Brand now. He blew out a pent-up breath. Why couldn't he just choose his own path? A comfortable existence, using his talent for psychology to help others in need. 2 path choices, one with Julia, the other a life venturing on alone. Before any decision could be made, he had to know. Turning to his brother, he asked, "You still interested in Julia?" Bronc faced him, looking confused. "What?" "Just asking. You called dibs on her, remember? Still want her?" Bronc glanced at their dad and Rebecca in the next seats up, but the plane's engine was too loud for them to overhear their conversation. Brand waited and waited, resisting the urge to tap his fingers on the armrest. Finally, Bronc shook his head. A thrill shot through him. Julia was possible, and now he had to choose. 2 voices spoke in his head at the same time. Why would you want to take on a religious girl? She's going to talk about God all the time, drive you nuts, expect you to go to church with her, make you sing, make you read the Bible. It seemed to drone on and on. When Brand shoved the louder voice aside, he finally heard the patient, quieter one, more impression than voice. It said very little. Follow me. Chapter 18. Bronc gripped the back of Rebecca's seat. The wheels screeched against the runway, bounced slightly, then touched down again to roll along safely to the ground. Thank God. Listen to him, thanking a God he'd only begun to acknowledge. But Bronc would do anything to bail out of this flying coffin. Even appealed to a God who wouldn't stop a mom from dying or make a father care about him. A God who didn't care if he drank himself to death. No, deep down he knew that wasn't true, but he wasn't willing to acknowledge that yet. Clay taxied his Piper up to a metal hangar and rolled to a stop. Then Bronc was up, hunched over, and squeezing between the seats toward the only door. His big body jostled his dad and Rebecca until he came up behind Peggy. He nudged her to open the door and get the heck out. The whole bunch started talking at once, scolding Bronc, annoyed by his impatience. "Just let me out of here, will ya?" he hollered back at Peggy's head. Or do you want me to lose my lunch all over you and Clay's precious plane?" That did it. He'd never seen a woman move so fast. Following behind Peggy, he climbed down the wing and jumped to the ground. He kept the urge to kiss the ground at her wraps, but barely. Slamming his hands on his hips, he pushed the nausea back down on a slow exhale and strode toward the only other building beside hangars on the private airport. He ignored the others calling his name. He needed a drink. This tiny building in Gillette, Wyoming, didn't have a bar, but maybe a soda pop would appease, at least soothe his trashed gut. As he let himself in the front door, he pondered a way to get back to California after the wedding without flying with Clay. Maybe the train? "Hey there, partner," the old guy at the counter said. "Looking a bit pale." "I'm fine." That was all the man would get. "Got soda pop?" "Right over there in the corner. Coca-Cola. Just need a coin." While Bronc busied himself digging into his pocket for a nickel, his family streamed in through the front door. Clay made a beeline for the old codger and clasped him in a handshake. "How you doing, Bill? Good to see you." "Hey, boss. Good to see you, too. Been a while. How's Missoula? See you got your girl here with you." "Wife." Hand at the small of her back, he guided her forward in greeting. "Peggy, do you remember Bill?" "Sure do. Good to see you." She swung an arm around Clay's waist and stepped under his armpit to be nestled close. Ignoring the twinge of jealousy, Bronc shifted his thoughts to the fire they'd had on the Bar 6 last month. Bill had flown Clay's plane so his crazy brother could jump out of it in smoke jumper fashion. Ended up saving the ranch from a wildfire. It had always been a draw as to who was the wildest Cooper brother. But in his own maturity, he changed his opinion. Clay had him, hands down. Bronc had heard everything about the incident from a frantic father who'd been stuck in California and had longed to be home to help. A bottle of Coca-Cola clunked into a slot in front of him. He reached into the circular tub, popped the top off, and took a big gulp, hoping the cold, sugary drink would settle his stomach and nerves. His twin came up next to him. "Can I have a swig?" That was the difference between him and Brand. He would have just grabbed it out of Brand's hand. Bronc handed it over. They shared everything, except their women, of course. Their women. That thought took him back to Shell. He'd originally thought Julie would be the one he'd pine over, ever since meeting the blonde beauty at Al the Wop's. But no. Surprised the heck out of him that the rough-and-tumble farm girl had set up camp in his mind. And other than an unexpected jealousy over the tycoon, he couldn't figure why. An elbow to the ribs got his attention. "Oomph! You daydreamin'?" Brand teased, then handed his cola back to him. "Maybe." "About what?" "Glad to be out of that metal contraption." That wasn't a lie. It just hadn't been his latest ponderings. Taking another massive gulp of cola, he looked out the window at the plane still parked in front of the hangar, dry as a bone now that they were out of California's torrential rain. "Dry as a bone now. Weird after being in heavy rain earlier today," Brand said. It didn't surprise Bronc that Brand echoed his thoughts almost verbatim. It happened all the time. Bronc nodded. "California gets rain in September. They call it Indian summer. Makes everything wet, then humid when it heats up again. Hope it's dry when we get back. Bad for Harper West. But the harvest is already in. It almost flooded completely back in the 50s during heavy rains. Nearly bankrupted Norman. Took him years to bounce back." Brand cursed. Isn't there something he can do to prevent it? "I suppose if he could afford it, he'd build up the levees." "They pretty weak?" "Yes and no. The important ones, the west levees, are loaded with thick blackberry vines. In order to permanently strengthen them, they'd have to remove the vines, then reinforce the base with double the fill. Not easy. or cheap. It was another thing Bronc had failed at. He'd tried reinforcing the borders with the tractor. According to Norman, he'd only managed to break down more vines and weaken the levees. "Let's go. Our ride is here." They said their goodbyes to Bill, then their dad hustled them outside to Hunter's Suburban and a grinning Stogie at the wheel. Bronc could still remember Stogie dragging him by the ear to sit on the bale of hay for time out as a kid, which happened often. The old man wasn't just an employee, he was an honorary uncle. Stogie hauled himself out of the driver's seat to greet them all. Handshakes, back-slapping, and hugs abounded. Bronc had to admit, it was good to see the old guy.
"How y'all doing? Been a long spell,"
he said to Cord and Rebecca. Not a thing was said to Bronc. He wasn't surprised. He'd always been the out-of-control embarrassment to the family. If he were to wander off, he was sure no one would miss him. Well, maybe Brand. But that was only because they shared the same brain. And he'd miss himself. Bronc snorted at his own ridiculous joke. "What?" Brand asked. "Nothing." Everyone piled into the vehicle, and since it was tight, Bronc was relegated to the small rumble-style seat in the back of the new-fangled Suburban, facing backwards with his knees practically in his face. It's what he got, every time. He didn't know if it was him, being the youngest, or the unruliest. Either way, this was his lot in life. At least with his family and at the Bar 6. Back in California, Norman had given him supervisory roles. Norman had done that, made him feel worthy, though Norman would say it was God who made him feel worthy. Over time, that had begun to change him, until that last dang sabotage on Cooper Ranch.
"All cinched in?"
Stogie hollered over his shoulder.
"Yep,"
Dad answered.
"Ready like sardines. Let's go."
Stogie took them off toward home, filling their dad in on the goings-on at the ranch the whole way. Bronc couldn't hear the conversation, but it was clear by the silence in the vehicle that all ears were tuned in. It was no wonder Bronc couldn't change his status as the least informed. No one cared to inform him. As always, Brand was in the middle of the activity. Bronc would have to get the scoop from his twin when they got home. Bronc's upper lip curled in a snarl that he barely managed to keep silent. Nothing was going to change. Forget about getting the scoop. As soon as they got to the Bar 6, he was going to slip away and drown himself in liquor. When Stogie made the turn onto the Bar 6, Bronc looked up to see the ranch sign overhead. A flood of memories poured in and weighed him down. He felt himself hunching over, trying to disappear, until Stogie hit a particularly deep pothole that rammed Bronc's head into the ceiling. Bronc cursed, then cursed again. "Slow it down, old man!" Everyone in the car began to reprimand him again. He tuned them out. Instead of feeling like he was where he belonged, he felt completely estranged. If he had his way, he would turn back around and even be willing to endure another nauseating flight to California. If he had his way. Chapter 19. Brand was elated to be gazing up at their grand two-story house with light and activity showing out of every rectangular window. He was home. The 6 of them had climbed out of the Suburban before Stogie parked it under a portable carport Brand had never seen before. When did his brothers have time to erect that? The California crew stretched their cramped legs, then hugged, shook hands, and slapped backs. It seemed everyone from the ranch was standing around in a tangle on the lawn, except for Trevor. That didn't surprise Brand, but it did worry him. Trevor never knew when to stop for 5 seconds to interact or rest. But Brand hadn't stopped smiling since he'd set eyes on the grand house and the entire family, cowhands included. This was home in a way that nothing else could be, even though it seemed his family was scattered these days. But not now. Now they had come together for the event of the year, Colt and Riley's wedding. Brand couldn't be happier. Until he laid eyes on his twin. He knew that look. Bronc was fixin' to take off again. Darn his hide. Couldn't he be a happy soul for once, ready to embrace happy times with the family? Brand sidled up to Bronc. "What's up?" He knew his voice had a harsh tone, but come on. It had been a long day, and now they were home. They should be rejoicing. "Nothing. You know who you're talking to, right?" Bronc turned his head and looked into Brand's eyes. They stared at the face of the other, as if inspecting a mirror. "I don't want to be here. Norm needs me." "You love it there, don't you?" Bronc stood taller. That was answer enough. But if Bronc was so happy at Harper West, why all the hard drinking? Even before Norm's cancer diagnosis. Maybe the strain of the farm work was more than Bronc could handle. Maybe it was something else entirely. Brand narrowed his gaze on Bronc. "We need a serious talk." Bronc's frown deepened, lowering his brows until his lashes nearly touched them. The hazel of Bronc's irises began to swirl into muddier colors under his darkening mood. "You need to let me be. Enjoy the family. That's what you do best." "Don't start with me." "Start what? Start getting you out of my brain? You've got your own. Spend time there." Bronc stomped toward the house. "I need a drink," he mumbled on his way. Brand looked at the milling crowd. No one seemed to notice Bronc's mood or his departure. Funny, Brand had never spotted that before. It couldn't be that he was the only one who cared about his troubled brother. So maybe it was just no one noticed because they expected he would take care of Bronc. A stirring of grief came over him. Bronc needed his family's support and didn't have it. And apparently, they hadn't cared any more about Brand, or they would be helping him with Bronc. They'd long since left him on his own. To handle Bronc, yes, but he'd never asked them to step up for his own needs. Now he wondered if they even would. Disheartened, Brand followed his twin. At the back door, he turned back to scan the crowd again. Not one person had noticed him leaving the scene either. He refused to draw any more conclusions, but he promised himself that he would be watching this week, see how this played out. Maybe he was finally getting somewhere with the root cause of Bronc's alcoholism. He entered the house, removed his boots, and headed toward the clatter of a cupboard slamming closed and a glass thumping the kitchen countertop. Brand was going to try the no judgment, no chastising, only camaraderie approach again. Hopefully with better success this time, because he had a new lens to look through. He clapped his duplicate on the back. "So, what you havin'?" Bronc looked up from his drink and studied him. "Why, I might join you." "You?" Brand laughed. "Yeah. Me? I drink with you all the time." "No, you don't. You watch me drink all the time." "I'd drink beer with you. Maybe I'd like something stronger. Ever think of that?" Bronc's eyebrows rose, but he only nodded and reached for another short glass from the cupboard. He splashed some whiskey into it and handed it to Brand. "Straight? Don't we have any soda pop on hand?" Bronc huffed a "I knew it" sort of laugh. "You want a highball? Fine, sissy. Grab a bottle of cola out of the fridge." Brand nearly smashed a fist into Bronc's chin, but caught himself at the last minute. This was the time for unity, not strife. No snide comments, either. He was proud of himself for the restraint. Instead, he reached into the fridge to retrieve a soda. Popping the cap off on the edge of the counter, he filled the rest of his glass with the sugary drink. He glanced back at Bronc and saw a smirk there. "What are you doing?" "Well, what do you mean?" Brand looked everywhere. The ceiling, the window, his drink, and the crowd out front, but kept his eyes off his brother. "Why are you drinking the hard stuff with me?" "I thought I'd try to keep up." See what the appeal is. You think you can keep up? Bronc snorted, nearly spewing his drink everywhere, then laughed. What's so funny? You. You're up to something. Before Brand could come up with a believable answer, Riley strode through the door and grinned. There are two of my favorite brothers. They both stared back at her. There were no words. They weren't the favorite anythings. Well, at least Bronc wasn't. Now, there's a sight you don't often see. Identical deer in the headlights. She giggled. Actually giggled. Brand had never heard her do that. He grinned back. Happy? Euphoric, she said with a dreamy look in her eyes. Tomorrow I marry the man who owns my heart. Can't get any better than that. A chunk of jealousy landed painfully in Brand's gut. One look at Bronc and he knew he felt the same way. Thankfully, it wasn't over the same girl anymore. Julia was first and foremost in Brand's mind now that his brother had cut her loose. He wondered who Bronc was thinking of. Taking his opportunity to tease her, Brand grabbed her chin to force her eyes to his. Where you having this event that has you giggling? Her eyes widened into glimmering emerald jewels. Yeah, the joy was there all right. Oh, you haven't seen it yet? She brightened and bobbed in place. Seen what? Come on, I want to show you both. She grabbed Bronc's hand, surprising the heck out of him by the look on his face, and Brand followed. Out the back door she went, pulling Bronc along with Brand trailing. Instead of joining the others on the front lawn, Riley hung a right around to the back of the house. Near the pond, Brand saw gobs of white strewn all over, along the ground, in the trees. It was everywhere. He finally recognized it as tulle and white lace, twined with strings of white Christmas bulbs. Closer to the pond stood a new trellis, likewise loaded with tulle and lace, and probably flowers tomorrow. Wow! Looks like it snowed back here. Could be there's going to be a wedding or something. Riley released Bronc's hand and turned to sock Brand in the arm. Ow! So it's not a wedding? Riley socked him again, then giggled. Again. Brand grinned and elbowed her. So, what you're saying is you want to marry my brother, the old soul? Isn't he kind of boring? Don't you even start with me, Brandon Cooper. Your brother is the epitome of masculine grace and beauty and kindness. I love him to insanity. Ah, so that's what's wrong with you. She put her hands to his chest and shoved. Strong little thing. She nearly upended him, but he backed up a few steps and caught himself, then grinned again. It was good to see her so happy. So where is this brother of mine? Ours, Bronc said, glaring at him. Right, ours. Brand noticed the empty glass in Bronc's hand. His brother had not only brought his drink out here, but already consumed it. No judgment, no chastising, Brand reminded himself. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching a hot rod tear down a drag strip seconds before the wheels came off and launched the chassis end over end. He reeled from the out-of-his-element feeling that came over him. Bronc's gaze wandered off toward the field just past the pond. He stood so still as he stared. Brand had a bad feeling about this. You okay? Bronc dropped his gaze onto his empty glass. I need a refill. Place looks great, Raoul. Then he turned and tramped off toward the house before Brand had the chance to rummage around in his twin's brain. Riley frowned. What's going on with him? Seems more troubled than normal. Troubled. Yeah, wish I knew, sis. My dad was right. He's been drinking more than ever. Do you have any ideas? Me? I don't even know Bronc. Not really. I mean, has anyone said anything to you about him? Colt talks about him. Always been a wild mess, according to him. I guess Colt used to try and get through to him, but gave up trying. I know nothing else."
"Yeah." Brand rubbed a hand across his mouth. "I'll figure it out. Eventually."
"In the meantime, you're all in the wedding, so we'll have the rehearsal tonight, and Stogue and Willie have a big dinner planned. I'm so glad you're here."
Riley flew into his arms for a hefty hug. Brand caught her and hugged her to his chest. "You might want to let go of my girl," a familiar voice said. Setting her back down, Brand turned to face Colt with a grin. "Just giving her a temporary brand, not a permanent one," he chuckled. "There's the groom. How are you, brother mine? Ready to tie the knot and get your ball and chain attached?" Colt's smile could heat the pond. It was no wonder this Cooper brother had the ladies of the town running after him before Riley came along. Of course, that was because Trevor never went anywhere where the female persuasion could find him. Well, that was going to change tomorrow, when practically the whole town was coming to him. Brand found himself looking forward to much more than just Colt and Riley's exchange of vows. Brand smiled back, using his same killer grin. He shook Colt's hand, then pulled him in for a hug. "God, you look taller, more mature in just a few weeks' time. You twins are giving Trev a run for his money. Could be you'll pass him up in height, if not girth. Norm must be working you hard out there in old California, eh? Should I be worried?" "It's you who ought to be worried. Tomorrow you turn in your bachelor card." Colt grinned again, snaking an arm around his girl and securing her to his side. "Isn't it great?" he said, down into her face, then giving her a quick peck on the lips and causing her pale skin to flush a deep pink, making her freckles stand out. He didn't take his eyes off of her as he said, "This little one is not getting away from me, ever again." "She never tried to," Brand said. "Yeah, that's what she says too, but I'm not so sure about that. Doesn't matter now. Tomorrow she's finally mine. For good." Brand waved a hand in the direction of the tool. "Everything ready? Do you need my help with anything?" Colt chuckled. "You wear a lot of hats, don't you, brother? Diplomat, psychologist, helper, babysitter." Yeah, that last jab was in reference to Bronc. Part of him wanted to knock Colt's block off for saying it, but he had to face the facts. He'd failed at his no judgment, no chastisement strategy approximately 2 minutes after committing to it. Maybe because it was exactly the wrong thing to do. This went way beyond babysitting, and suddenly Brand wasn't so sure he could handle it himself. Did Bronc need to go into a recovery program like Julia said? Did he need to enter her recovery program? At her church? He growled to himself. Did everything have to center around an invisible God? And there was no doubt his woman was one of those devotees. "Everything is done, isn't it, Spitfire?" Colt's voice broke into Brand's musings. "Yep, Blue Eyes. All ready to go." Her smile seemed to radiate sunshine into Colt's soul as he beamed back, then kissed the stuffing out of her. Brand turned away and trotted back toward the house. He was happy for his number 2 brother, but Colt's happiness put a damper on his own. It made him anxious to see Julia, and he wasn't even sure what he and Julia were yet. "Back already?" Bronc slurred. How many drinks had he had already? Brand tried to envision his brother walking into the recovery center of his own free will. That was never going to happen. He had to figure this out on his own. And he only had one card to play. "Hey, brother. Let's make our apologies and head into town." "Longhorn Saloon?" "Yep. You go get the ranch truck. I'll tell Dad." Chapter 20.
20 minutes later, Bronc and Brand rested their elbows on the gleaming wooden bar. This time, Brand watched Bronc flash his smile around the bar while he wore the scowl. The locals all welcomed them back with a flourish, buying them drinks, slapping them on the backs. The funny thing was, Bronc's smile didn't reach his eyes. He was not enjoying this as much as he'd like people to think. While Bronc visited with his drinking friends, Brand stared at the mirror behind the bar, noticing their opposite personalities beaming out of identical faces. The minutes ticked by. He tried to tune in to the radio's report on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but couldn't quite do it. So much was happening in the world today, yet Brand was wasting his time here. Time he would never get back. And for what? Colt was right. He was babysitting Bronc again, and now he'd even begun drinking the heavy stuff right alongside him. Stop it, Brand. The whole point of going to the bar was to get Bronc talking about why he was spiraling, not watching him spiral. Time to get on with it. Brand leaned in, speaking directly in Bronc's ear. Last drink. We're going outside for a walk, then home after this. Why? Bronc's face screwed up into a nasty grimace. You take all the fun out of everything. Everything. Bronc slurred as he poked Brand in the chest. Rehearsal is this evening. You willing to trash Colt's wedding? You're in it, man. Bronc's brows rose in confusion. You that drunk that you don't remember? Riley just told us that only 2 hours ago. Let's get you some coffee. Brand waved at the bartender, but Bronc slammed Brand's hand down onto the bar, holding it there. Not done drinking. Yes, you are. Brand yanked his hand out from under Bronc's, then picked up Bronc's whiskey, downing it himself. He choked as it burned down his throat. How did Bronc do this? He never even grimaced anymore. There! He slammed the glass upside down on the bar. Done! He hollered to the bartender. Coffee, Mills! Mills splashed coffee into 2 mugs and brought it to them. Thanks. Brand handed one to his brother, giving him the no arguments allowed look. Bronc stared at the mug for a moment, then sipped at it. Before long, he had it drunk, and Brand caught Mills' eyes and pointed for a refill. After Bronc's 3rd cup and one of his own, he caught Bronc by the back of his collar and lifted. Time to go. Whenever Bronc was this drunk, he never gave Brand a hard time. The fact that he submitted so readily now meant he'd somehow snuck a lot more whiskey in at home than Brand realized. Probably when Brand left to tell Dad they were heading into town. How could he have missed that? One good once-over of Bronc, and Brand knew the walk he had planned was out of question. Instead, after 2 attempts, he got Bronc into the truck, then got behind the wheel himself. He turned toward Bronc. It's time you fess up. What's wrong, brother? His stern voice had an element of worry even he could hear. Bronc slumped in the seat as he inspected his fingernails. Nothing. Wrong answer. No response. We have an hour we can waste before the rehearsal. So, do you want to talk or just sit here? Bronc's bloodshot eyes turned toward him. Why do you need to know? You are coming apart at the seams. Do you not see that? I'm worried about you. Dad's worried about you. Bronc scoffed and turned back to his fingernail inspection. Dad couldn't care less. Brand slammed a hand to the steering wheel. Bronc jumped. Crap! Stop doing stuff like that. Want me to whiz my pants? Stop saying Dad doesn't care. He's so worried he summoned me to California to rescue you. See what I mean? If he cared, he would have rescued me himself. His words were slurred, but Brand caught every one. He tried. You weren't responding. He took me away from Trevor, which nearly killed Dad to do so, by the way. and left him with one less worker in order to save you from yourself. Whatever this is, it started over a month ago. I have been over the events before Norman's diagnosis in my mind and have come up short, other than what's happened on the Bar 6. What happened to his plan to take his time this week to cajole Bronc into a confession? Must be the dang booze. Brand rubbed a hand over his eyes and down his face, feeling the effects. When his gaze reached Bronc again, he noticed a slight widening of his twin's eyes. Brand narrowed his. Bronc looked away. "You can't help me." Brand dropped his palm from the scruff of his chin and stared at his brother. "I'm listening." I killed 24 cattle and a bull." "What? What the heck are you talking about?" Bronc shrugged. "Okay." Brand turned a knee onto the seat so he could get a better view of his brother. He laid a hand on his shoulder, offering support. "Go on." Bronc's eyes glassed over, filling with tears. "It's my fault the ranch is struggling. Dad and Trevor and the rest might lose everything. Don't you get it? I did that." "You did what?" Bronc yanked on the door handle, scrambled out, and nearly landed on his knees. Brand flew out his door and rounded the truck, catching hold of an arm before his brother crumpled to the ground. But he knew better than to demand Bronc return to the truck. Jerking his arm out of Brand's hold, Bronc stumbled off a few feet and kicked the dirt, then did it again, cussing a blue streak. "It's my fault. Don't you hear me?" he shouted. The whole neighborhood heard him. But Brand remained silent, waited. "It was me! Right in there!" He shoved an angry finger in the direction of the bar. "At that same dratted bar stool! My stool! The place where I get plastered and blab like a dang drunken fool. The place where I destroyed our dad's legacy and nearly put Trev in his grave. It was me!" He poked at his own chest so hard, Brand figured it would leave a bruise. Brand didn't know what to do. He almost reached out to pull Bronc into an embrace, but he'd only get shoved away. What could he do? Julia would pray. He wanted to laugh. What good would that do? To say words to an invisible god? She was duping herself. Bronc dropped to his knees in the dirt beyond the parking lot. Brand could hear the crunch of his knees. As hard as he'd hit, he had to have done some damage. Brand stood frozen as Bronc cupped his face in his palms and yelled, "God, help me!" Brand was stunned. But of course, Bronc didn't mean that. "Come on, brother. Let's get back in the truck." Brand put a hand to Bronc's shoulder and tried to lift, but Bronc twisted, then lashed out at him. "Leave me alone! Go home without me! No one wants me there. I'm a menace to the ranch and the family." Bronc looked up at him, tears glistening in his eyes. Brand nearly fell to his own knees. He'd never seen his brother like this. Bronc had always been too confident, too wild, too indifferent to let life get to him. Sure, he'd get drunk, but he was usually a happy drunk and talkative, not inconsolable. Nothing Brand was saying or doing was getting him anywhere. Brand just stood over him, at a loss. Again, Julia came to mind. Pray. He could almost hear her say. Fine. He'd do it. For Bronc. In his head only, though, so no one would know. God, if you're there, please calm Bronc down. Make him tell me what's wrong. Well, that was probably too demanding. But he didn't know how to pray. It would have to do. As if Brand's prayer had unplugged a stopper, Bronc broke. He leaned over with his head in his hands and sobbed. The pitiful sound slashed Brand's heart. Okay, this was the opposite of what he'd asked God for. Figured God wouldn't listen to his prayer. Minutes passed as Bronc let the tears fall and sobbed like his heart was being torn in half. Brand just laid a hand on his shoulder and waited, angry that God couldn't answer a simple little prayer. Finally, Bronc fell silent, scrubbing at his face, then leaned back on his heels and rose. He turned to Brand, then swung arms around his shoulders and squeezed him like his life depended on it. Thanks, brother. For what? He wanted to say, but didn't. When Bronc stepped back, he looked Brand straight in the eyes. We have to talk. Okay, maybe that prayer did do something. Let's get back in the truck. Bronc complied, his movement steady and sober. He waited for Brand to climb in behind the wheel again, then said, Last year, before I left for California, I sat at that bar in there. He pointed toward the building again. I had a conversation with a bunch of strangers. They were asking questions of the local ranchers. I can't remember now who else was there other than our neighbor, Peterson. Oh, great, the one who despised the Coopers. But Brand didn't comment. Oh, that widow Dad was tangled up with? Her foreman was there too? I can't remember, or didn't know, any of the others. Joe? The widow Mayfield's foreman? Yeah, that's him. Well, go on. Brand was still amazed how clear-headed Bronc was right now. Had that been another answer to his lame prayer? Probably not, but he appreciated it nonetheless. Someone I didn't know wanted to know what plants they should eliminate from their fields that can harm cattle. Planned to buy a few head. He cleared his throat, like a lump had formed there. Lots of ideas were being thrown out. I said poison hemlock, larkspur, local weed. Silence was thick in the cab. Brand waited. Bronc seemed to be struggling with what was coming next. Go on. I'm such a blowhard. Gotta have the dang attention when I'm drinking. What makes me like that, Vanilla? He rubbed a hand over his mouth, then did a quick swipe under his eyes. Like what, Oates? The side of Bronc's mouth lifted slightly, but a smile didn't emerge. Brand, you're never gonna forgive me. None of you will forgive me. I don't forgive myself. He reached up and ran both hands through his hair, then yanked, leaving the dark strand sticking out all over. Brand patted him on the shoulder again. It couldn't be that bad. Tell me. I'm so danged arrogant. Have to be the know-it-all. I blurted out that a surefire way to get your cattle killed was with oleander. That all parts of that dang plant can give cattle cardiac arrests. Brand sucked in a breath, then choked on it. Yeah. Now you see. But I didn't stop there. Oh, no. I had to blab some more. All the focus was on me, you see. Everyone loves you. Everyone wants to listen to you. But they were listening to me that night. He shifted his gaze out the passenger window, his elbow on the panel, his hand across his mouth. From his profile, Brand could see another tear slip down his cheek. Dang, Bronc. He'd given Cooper's enemies the exact recipe to kill their cattle months later. Brand wanted to think it wasn't connected, but it had to be. Who would have even considered oleander otherwise? It didn't even grow in the area. This was something they needed to tell the sheriff. Bronc dropped his head in his hands again. Take me home. I need to tell everyone. Oh, no, you won't. This is a happy time. Colt's wedding. You will not destroy the celebration. What do you suggest, then? Keep it to yourself. Live with it. Let it help you make changes for good. After the wedding, we'll talk to Hunter's fiancée. Jackie is a deputy sheriff. She'll know what to do. Bronc glared at him, then twisted to open his door. I need a drink. Brand grabbed his arm and yanked him back in place. No. The changes I was talking about, those start now. We're going home. We're going to the rehearsal, and you're going to behave yourself. Think of Colt and Riley. Brand watched as his brother's eyes softened. His expression slowly morphed from anger to contrition. Fine. I'll be good. Bronc closed his door. For now.